Good afternoon, everyone. Today the story will be about the most dangerous car thief in America. Dustin Riggs' story begins in a small town in the southern United States. He was born into a poor family where every day was a struggle for survival. His father worked at a factory, and his mother took care of the house and raised 3 children. Since childhood, Dustin felt different from everyone else. He was an intelligent and curious boy, but a constant sense of injustice and poverty left deep marks on his character. One day, when Dustin was only 10 years old, he first encountered a car that left an indelible impression on him. It was an old car parked in a vacant lot near their house. She hadn't driven for a long time, and the local kids used her as a playground. Dustin often went there alone to sit behind the wheel, imagining himself as the driver. He carefully studied every detail of the car, disassembled and reassembled the engine, trying to understand how everything worked. He liked to smell the oil and hear the sound of the engine, even if it was broken. Those hours spent alone with the car were the best moments of Dustin's childhood. They helped him forget about problems at home and find solace in dreams of the future. However, real life did not allow the boy to forget. One day, when he returned home, he discovered that his father had lost his job. There was not enough money even for food, and the family found itself on the brink of survival. Then Dustin made a decision that would change his life forever. One evening, he snuck into the garage of a neighbor who was known for his wealth. Dustin knew that there was a brand new sports car there, which he often saw on the street. He had studied locks and security systems in books and on the internet, so he knew how to bypass the security. That night he stole his first car. This was his first step towards the world of crime. Dustin quickly realized that his ability to steal cars could become a source of income. He became increasingly skilled at his craft, leaving no trace and always finding ways to evade the police. His name quickly became famous in criminal circles, and he himself became a legend among car thieves. As an adult, Dustin moved to Washington, D.C. to continue his career in a larger city. Here, new challenges and dangers awaited him, but he was ready for them. Dustin knew that his path would be difficult, but he never forgot his dreams and goals that were born in those distant childhood years spent behind the wheel of an old car. In Washington, Dustin quickly realized that it had its own laws and rules. The city was filled with rich and powerful people whose cars cost a fortune. It was a great opportunity for him, but also a huge risk. Dustin wasn't the only one who wanted a piece of the pie, and the competition among car thieves was fierce. He decided to act carefully and gradually gain his reputation. Dustin selected several targets and carefully studied their daily routines, routes, and security systems. The first few hijackings were perfectly planned and executed without a single mistake. His name began to be heard again in criminal circles, but now on the scale of the whole city. Over time, influential people who needed his services began to approach Dustin. He stole cars not only for profit, but also to fulfill orders, which brought him even more money and influence. One of these customers was Mr. Harris, a large businessman with a dubious reputation. He offered Dustin a large sum to steal his competitor's car, and Dustin couldn't refuse the opportunity. Having completed the task, Dustin received not only money, but also a new acquaintance, which opened the door to the world of even larger and more dangerous operations. Mr. Harris invited him to become part of his organization, which was involved in various types of criminal activities, from smuggling to racketeering. Dustin agreed, seeing this as a chance to expand his opportunities and make more money. But with money and influence came new problems. The police began to pay more attention to his activities, and competitors began to set up traps and setups. One day, returning home after another successful theft, Dustin noticed that he was being followed. He realized that he could no longer trust anyone, not even his partners. To protect himself, Dustin began to hide. He moved to a small town on the outskirts of Washington, where he rented a modest house and tried not to attract attention to himself. He continued his activities, but now he acted much more carefully and thought through every step more carefully. Dustin knew that if he made even one mistake, it could cost him his freedom or even his life. As time passed, Dustin continued to elude justice, but tension and constant fear became his constant companions. He could no longer trust anyone and lived in constant readiness to escape. However, despite all the difficulties, he continued to move forward, not forgetting his dreams and goals that were once born in his heart. Dustin's story continues, and every new day brings him new challenges and dangers, but he knows that he must be strong and smart to survive in this world. He is not going to give up and will continue to fight until the very end. In a small town on the outskirts of Washington, Dustin lived under an assumed name and tried not to stand out from the crowd. He established connections with local criminal elements and began to work through them to minimize risks. His ability to plan and execute car thefts without error made him an indispensable partner for local criminal gangs. One day, when he was working on his next order, he was approached by a man named Jonathan, who offered an unusual and very tempting business. Jonathan was a representative of a large international criminal organization and was looking for talented performers for a large-scale operation. Dustin couldn't miss this chance, but he knew it would be the most dangerous thing in his life. The task was to steal several luxury cars from a secure garage in the center of Washington, where the collector cars of one of the richest people in the country were kept. Dustin knew it wouldn't be easy, but the risk and the promise of money were worth it. He began to prepare, studying every detail of the garage, security routes, and security systems. A few weeks before the operation, Dustin assembled a team of trusted people, each of whom was a master of his craft. They developed a detailed plan that included distracting the guards, disabling the alarm, and quickly exiting the area. On the night of the operation, everything went according to plan. The team worked well together, and Dustin managed to steal all the cars without a single trace. However, as soon as they left the garage, problems began. It turned out that someone from the team handed them over to the police. Dustin realized that they had only minutes to escape. He divided the team and everyone went in different directions. He himself headed to a previously prepared shelter in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Dustin hid for several days, analyzing what had happened and trying to figure out who could betray him. During this time, he followed the news and realized that the police were hunting him more persistently than ever. He could not stay in the city and decided to hide in another state. Having changed his clothes and appearance, Dustin went to the West, where he hoped to start a new life and find a traitor. He knew that this man continued to be a threat and might try to turn him over to the authorities again. In a new place, he did what he did best, stealing cars, but now he acted even more carefully and secretly. Dustin continued to build his criminal empire, but his main goal was to find and punish the one who betrayed him. He knew that new dangers and challenges awaited him along this path, but he was ready to go to the end to protect himself and his future. Dustin's story continues as his life becomes a constant struggle for survival and justice in a world where every step could be his last. On the West Coast, Dustin settled in a small town hidden among the mountains. Nobody knew him here, and it was the perfect place to lay low and continue his research. He settled in a modest house on the outskirts and tried not to attract attention to himself, working under the guise of an auto mechanic in a local workshop. This allowed him to remain in the shadows and at the same time follow the news in the criminal world. Dustin knew that a traitor from his team was still at large and could try to turn him in at any moment. He began to carefully search for information about his former comrades, finding out which of them could betray him. Every day he looked through crime reports, news, and rumors trying to find clues. One evening, while sitting at the computer, Dustin came across news about the arrest of one of his former partners, Tom. The article mentioned that Tom was captured while trying to sell information about a major criminal network. Dustin realized that this could be his chance to find the traitor. He decided to contact people who might know Tom and find out more about his arrest. A few days later, Dustin met with an informant in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He confirmed that Tom tried to sell the information, but did not manage to do this before the arrest. The informant also hinted that someone from Tom's team is still at large and may be aware of the events. Dustin realized that time was working against him. He began to act more decisively, infiltrating the city's criminal circles and trying to find out the location of his former partners. One of them was Jack, known for his connection with an international criminal organization. Dustin knew Jack might be the key. At night, Dustin sneaked into Jack's house, knowing that he often worked late and left important documents in his office. He quickly found the necessary papers and made copies without leaving any traces. Among the documents, he found records of transactions and meetings that could shed light on the traitor. Dustin spent the next few weeks analyzing the data. As a result, he found references to meetings that coincided with his assumptions. The name that came up most often belonged to a certain Michael, one of the lesser-known members of the team who, however, was always on hand. Dustin decided to hunt down Michael. He began to follow him, finding out his daily routine and the places he visited. One evening, when Michael left the bar, Dustin intercepted him in the parking lot. He pushed him against the wall and demanded an explanation. Michael, frightened, admitted that he was forced to betray Dustin under the threat of his life and the life of his family. After receiving the confession, Dustin realized that the real enemy was someone much more powerful than he thought. Michael said that behind all this was the same international criminal organization that Dustin had already encountered. Now he had a new goal, not just to find and punish the traitor, but also to expose and destroy those who tried to destroy him. Dustin knew this would be the most dangerous and difficult thing he had ever done, but he was ready for the challenge. His story continued, and every new day brought him closer to solving the mystery and justice in a world where trust is worth its weight in gold, and betrayal is punished in the most severe way. Having received information from Michael, Dustin realized that his enemy is an international criminal organization that intends to eliminate him by any means necessary. He knew that a direct confrontation with such a powerful structure could be suicidal, so he decided to act covertly and carefully plan every step. First of all, Dustin decided to understand the structure of the organization and find its weak points. He knew that for this, he would need allies and information that could only be obtained from the inside. Remembering his old connections, he contacted one of his former partners who once worked for this organization, but then went into the shadows. This man, known as the Fox, was a master of camouflage and infiltration. The Fox agreed to help Dustin, but set a condition. He wanted to receive a share of future trophies. Dustin agreed, realizing that he couldn't cope without Fox's help. Together, they began to develop a plan to introduce it into the organization. Dustin and Liz started with small operations, testing reactions and studying the security system. They discovered that the organization was using several fronts, including legitimate business, to hide its true intentions. Gradually, they infiltrated the circle of trust, operating under the guise of petty criminals seeking to make a name for themselves. One of the key figures in the organization was a man named Victor, who ran most of the operations on the West Coast. Victor was known for his cruelty and shrewdness, and Dustin knew that gaining his trust would not be easy. They started with small tasks, completing them with precision and without unnecessary fuss. Over time, Victor began to notice their success and offered them larger tasks. Each new mission was even more risky, but Dustin and Liz acted harmoniously, gradually gaining the trust of Victor and his people. They learned that the organization was planning a major operation related to weapon smuggling and decided to use this moment to strike. Dustin and Liss developed a plan that was supposed to not only disrupt the operation, but also reveal the names of the main persons of the organization. They secretly contacted the authorities, offering assistance in exchange for reduced possible punishment and protection. The police agreed, seeing this as an opportunity to expose a powerful criminal network. On the day of the operation, Dustin and Liss acted according to plan, coordinating their actions with the police. They entered the warehouse where the weapons were stored and installed wiretapping and tracking devices. Once the operation began, they provided coordinates and details to the authorities, who immediately surrounded and captured the warehouse. The arrests followed a chain, capturing key figures in the organization. Victor was among those detained, and under pressure from evidence, he began to hand over his accomplices, hoping to mitigate his sentence. Dustin and Liss completed their mission, exposing a powerful criminal network and securing protection for themselves. However, this is not the end of Dustin's story. He knew that there would always be those who would want to take the place of the defeated, and that his skills would be in demand more than once. But now, he was ready for any challenge, knowing that he was able to cope with the most difficult and dangerous tasks. After a successful operation to expose a criminal organization, Dustin and Liss found themselves in a new reality. They became heroes among those who knew of their feat, but also attracted the attention of those who wanted revenge for their ruined plans. Dustin understood that a quiet life was still far away, and his skills would be in demand more than once. He decided to use his time in hiding to prepare for future challenges. The Fox, with his experience in camouflage and infiltration, proposed creating their own network of informants and allies that would help them stay one step ahead of their enemies. Together they began to build a network of connections, recruiting former criminals who wanted to come out of the shadows and those who had access to important information. They created their own organization, which was engaged not only in criminal activities, but also in exposing other criminal groups, using their skills and connections. One day they were approached by a man who introduced himself as an undercover FBI agent. He offered cooperation in exchange for information and assistance in exposing an even larger international organization involved in human and arms trafficking. Dustin and Liss realized that this could be both an opportunity and a huge risk, but decided to take this step. They began collecting information and conducting operations, working on two fronts, ensuring the security of their organization and helping the FBI expose the criminals. Each new case became more and more difficult and dangerous, but Dustin did not give up. He knew that only in this way could he achieve his goal, not only to survive, but also to change the world in which he lives. During one of the operations, Dustin and Liss stumbled upon information about the mysterious leader of an international organization, known under the pseudonym Ghost. This man was in the shadows and controlled most of the illegal business around the world. Dustin realized that his real test was just beginning. The Ghost was incredibly careful, and every step in his tracks required maximum concentration and precision. Dustin and Fox began to act, infiltrating the Phantom's inner circle, learning about his plans and weaknesses. Each step brought them closer to their main goal but also made them more vulnerable. One day they received information about a major meeting of the leaders of the organization, which the elusive man himself was supposed to attend. This was an opportunity that could not be missed. Dustin and Liss developed a plan that involved coordinating with the FBI and local authorities to take down the organization once and for all. On the day of the meeting, Dustin and Liss entered the place under the guise of security guards. They knew that any mistake could cost them their lives, but they also understood that there might not be another chance like this. When the meeting began, they signaled to the authorities and took action. The coordinated attack was quick and effective. Most of the organization's leaders were arrested, but the Phantom managed to escape. Dustin knew that this was not the end, but only the beginning of a new chapter. He vowed that he would find and stop the Phantom, no matter how difficult it might be. Now Dustin had a new goal and new motivation. His story continues, and he is ready for new challenges and adventures, knowing that every step brings him closer to justice and safety in a world where evil always finds new ways to exist. After the high-profile operation and the escape of the ghost, Dustin and Fox realized that they had to temporarily lay low and focus on small matters so as not to attract attention to themselves. But one day, an old acquaintance approached them, offering an interesting opportunity. Charlie, an old friend of Dustin and a talented hacker, reported on a large businessman named Richard Carter, who often transports large sums of money and valuable documents in his armored car. Charlie knew that Carter was planning an important deal, and the entire amount would be transported in his car. Dustin and Liz decided that this business would be an excellent opportunity not only to make money, but also to test their skills. They began to prepare, carefully studying Carter's travel routes, his meeting schedule, and security system. The first thing they did was take note of Carter's guards and their habits. Dustin and Fox spent several weeks observing them, identifying weak points and timing of the changing of the guard. Charlie, meanwhile, was working on hacking the car's security and CCTV systems. When everything was ready, they developed a detailed plan. Dustin and Fox were going to intercept Carter's car on one of the sections of the road where the mobile signal was weak. They chose a location on a narrow country road where the car would be most vulnerable. On the day of the operation, Charlie hacked into the video surveillance system and temporarily turned off the cameras on the section of the road where Carter was supposed to drive. Dustin and Fox disguised themselves as road workers and placed a "Repair Works" sign on the road to slow down the car. As Carter's car approached the repair zone, Dustin and Liz blocked the road, creating the appearance of an accident. They put on masks and, holding weapons at the ready, approached the armored vehicle. At that moment, Charlie remotely disabled the car's alarm and locks. The guards tried to resist, but Dustin and Liz acted quickly and decisively. They subdued the guards and forced Carter to get out of the car. Dustin found a safe with money and documents, while Fox kept the situation under control. Having taken everything they needed, they fled in a pre-prepared car, leaving Carter and his guards on the road. They quickly headed to their hideout, where Charlie had already prepared everything for the quick distribution of the spoils. The operation was successful, and Dustin and Fox realized that their union had become even stronger. But they also knew that such successes attracted attention, and so they decided to lie low for a while to avoid possible persecution. Dustin and Fox continued to build their criminal empire, choosing their targets carefully and acting with utmost precision. But deep down, Dustin knew that the real challenge was yet to come, and every day he prepared for a new meeting with the Phantom, knowing that this day would come sooner or later. After the high-profile operation and the escape of the ghost, Dustin and Fox realized that they had to temporarily lay low and focus on small matters so as not to attract attention to themselves. But one day, an old acquaintance approached them, offering an interesting opportunity. Charlie, an old friend of Dustin and a talented hacker, reported on a large businessman named Richard Carter, who often transports large sums of money and valuable documents in his armored car. Charlie knew that Carter was planning an important deal, and the entire amount would be transported in his car. Dustin and Liz decided that this business would be an excellent opportunity, not only to make money, but also to test their skills. They began to prepare, carefully studying Carter's travel routes, his meeting schedule, and security system. The first thing they did was take note of Carter's guards and their habits. Dustin and Fox spent several weeks observing them, identifying weak points and timing of the changing of the guard. Charlie, meanwhile, was working on hacking the car's security and CCTV systems. When everything was ready, they developed a detailed plan. Dustin and Fox were going to intercept Carter's car on one of the sections of the road where the mobile signal was weak. They chose a location on a narrow country road where the car would be most vulnerable. On the day of the operation, Charlie hacked into the video surveillance system and temporarily turned off the cameras on the section of the road where Carter was supposed to drive. Dustin and Fox disguised themselves as road workers and placed a repair works sign on the road to slow down the car. As Carter's car approached the repair zone, Dustin and Lee's blocked the road, creating the appearance of an accident. They put on masks and, holding weapons at the ready, approached the armored vehicle. At that moment, Charlie remotely disabled the car's alarm and locks. The guards tried to resist, but Dustin and Liz acted quickly and decisively. They subdued the guards and forced Carter to get out of the car. Dustin found a safe with money and documents, while Fox kept the situation under control. Having taken everything they needed, they fled in a pre-prepared car, leaving Carter and his guards on the road. They quickly headed to their hideout, where Charlie had already prepared everything for the quick distribution of the spoils. The operation was successful, and Dustin and Fox realized that their union had become even stronger. But they also knew that such successes attracted attention, and so they decided to lie low for a while to avoid possible persecution. Several months have passed since the successful robbery of Carter's car. Dustin and Liz continued to conduct their business, but became more careful. They understood that the Phantom would not leave them alone, and sooner or later would find a way to take revenge. One evening, when they were in their hideout, the Fox received a message from one of their informants. The message spoke of a major deal in which the Phantom was to participate. Dustin and Fox decided this was their chance to strike. They carefully prepared for the operation. The plan was simple: infiltrate the meeting place, gather as much information as possible, and leave unnoticed. Dustin and Liz knew that they needed to act as carefully as possible so as not to attract attention. On the day of the operation, they arrived at the site, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. They took up positions and began to observe. Soon the cars appeared and the Ghost and his men entered the building. Dustin and Liz quietly made their way inside and hid on the top floor, from where it was convenient to monitor what was happening. The operation was going according to plan until one of the guards accidentally noticed them. A shootout ensued. Dustin and Fox began to retreat, covering each other. At the moment when they were almost out of the building, Fox was seriously injured. Dustin tried to pull his friend out, but he insisted that Dustin save himself. "Run, Dustin! They'll be here soon!" the Fox shouted, firing back at the approaching guards. Dustin, knowing that Fox was right, was forced to retreat. With a heavy heart, he left the building, hearing shots behind him. Returning to the shelter, Dustin felt defeated. Losing Fox was a hard blow, but he knew he couldn't stop. He knew that the elusive man would now target him and that he had to be ready for the next step. Dustin decided that the best way to honor Fox's memory was to finish what he started. He focused on gathering information about the elusive man, using all his contacts and resources. Dustin carefully planned his actions, not taking unnecessary risks and avoiding rash steps. One day, while looking through his notes, Dustin discovered a trail that could lead him to the Phantom. He knew that this path would be dangerous, but now he had a goal: to avenge the Fox and put an end to the criminal activities of the Ghost. Dustin's story continues. He is left alone, but his determination and skills become his main weapon. Every day he gets closer to his goal, knowing that success depends only on his skill and caution. Several days passed after the road trip, and Dustin continued to recuperate and analyze the data received from the flash drive. He understood that every step must be carefully thought out so as not to fall into a trap. While researching the information, Dustin discovered that the elusive man was planning a meeting with key figures in his organization at one of his secret facilities. The meeting place was a heavily guarded warehouse on the outskirts of the city where the elusive man stored his most valuable cargo. Dustin knew this would be his chance to get inside and gather the information he needed to make the final strike against the elusive man. The plan was risky, but Dustin was ready for anything. He decided to act at night when the guards would be less attentive. Having changed into work clothes and taking with him a minimal amount of equipment, he went to the warehouse. When Dustin arrived at the scene, he noticed several guards patrolling. He found a weak spot in the security, a fence at the back of the warehouse, where the CCTV camera did not cover a small area. Taking advantage of this, he made his way inside and moved secretly around the territory, avoiding encounters with the guards. Inside the warehouse, he saw many boxes of weapons and other contraband goods, but his goal was different: to find the Phantom's office and obtain incriminating documents. Dustin moved along the corridors, trying not to make any noise. Finally, he found an office whose door was locked. Using his lockpicking skills, he quickly opened the lock and went inside. In the office, he found a safe, which he assumed contained important documents. Having broken into the safe, he discovered many folders and flash drives with information about the Phantom's transactions, partners, and financial flows. Suddenly, he heard footsteps outside the door. Security guards began patrolling the hallway, and Dustin realized he didn't have much time. He collected all the data he could find and quickly left the office. However, as he was leaving the building, one of the guards noticed him and raised the alarm. The chase began. Dustin, using his knowledge of the territory, was able to elude pursuit and get out of the warehouse. He reached his shelter and began to study the obtained data. Among them, he found a detailed plan for the Ghost's next major operation, as well as information about his personal meetings and connections. This data could be the key to the final exposure of the Phantom. Dustin decided that the time had come for the final blow. He contacted old reliable contacts who could help him organize an attack on the elusive man's headquarters and gather evidence to hand over to the authorities. The operation was carefully planned. Dustin and his allies infiltrated the headquarters under cover of darkness. They acted quickly and decisively, neutralizing the guards and collecting evidence. When they reached the main office, Dustin came face to face with the elusive man. The Ghost, realizing that his plans had come to an end, tried to resist, but was quickly neutralized. Dustin personally arrested him and handed him over to the authorities along with all the evidence of his criminal activities. Dustin's story was coming to an end. He was finally able to avenge the death of the Fox and destroy the criminal empire of the Phantom. But he understood that his journey was not over yet. Dustin decided to continue fighting crime, using his skills and experience to help those in need of protection. Several months passed after the arrest of the Phantom, and Dustin continued to live, hiding from possible pursuers and pursuing his new mission, exposing criminal organizations. However, despite his efforts, he felt that something was left unfinished. The information he had gathered indicated that the elusive man was still actively running his organization from prison through front men. One day, while analyzing new data, Dustin came across an important detail. It turned out that the Phantom had a secret hideout that few people knew about. This place served as the headquarters for the elusive man's most trusted men, and it was from there that he continued to direct his operations. Dustin decided it was time to make the final blow and end Ghost once and for all. He carefully planned his operation, knowing that this mission would be the most dangerous of his life. He contacted several trusted allies to enlist their support and assistance. On the night of the operation, Dustin and his team arrived at the Phantom's secret hideout, an old mansion in the forest. They acted quietly and carefully, neutralizing the guards and secretly moving towards the main building. Dustin knew that every mistake could cost him his life, so every step was carefully planned. When they got inside, Dustin discovered that the Phantom was in one of the rooms on the top floor. He acted quickly and decisively, making his way to the goal. His allies remained below, protecting him from possible attacks. Upon reaching the Phantom's room, Dustin came face to face with him. The Ghost, seeing his sworn enemy, tried to run, but Dustin was faster. A short but fierce fight ensued. The Ghost pulled out a gun, but Dustin managed to knock it out of his hands and knock it to the floor. Grabbing Phantom by the throat, Dustin looked him in the eye and said, "That's for Fox." The ghost tried to resist, but was too weak. Dustin knew this man deserved no mercy. Without hesitation, he used the knife to finish him off once and for all. When it was all over, Dustin stood over Ghost's body, knowing his duty was done. He returned to his allies, who had already managed to neutralize all the guards and collect evidence of the organization's criminal activities. With this evidence, Dustin and his team left the mansion, turning over all the information to the authorities. The revelation of the elusive man and his organization was big news, and Dustin was finally able to feel the satisfaction of a completed mission. After Dustin was done with the Phantom, his life again began to resemble a never-ending struggle for survival. Despite the fact that the main enemy was eliminated, the world of crime left no room for rest. Dustin realized that his skills as a car thief could still be in demand, and decided to return to his main activity while avoiding the attention of the authorities. Several months passed and Dustin continued his criminal career, working alone. He carefully planned each theft, choosing the most expensive and well-protected cars. Thanks to his experience and knowledge, he remained elusive to the police and competitors. One day, Dustin received a tip from one of his old contacts about a prominent businessman known for his collection of rare cars. A unique sports car was stored in the businessman's garage, the cost of which exceeded several $1,000,000. This goal was perfect for Dustin, risky, but potentially very rewarding. Dustin carefully studied every aspect of the operation. He learned that the businessman often left his garage unguarded at night, relying on a sophisticated alarm and video surveillance system. Dustin knew that to successfully hijack, he would need to hack into these systems and act as quickly as possible. On the night of the operation, Dustin entered the mansion using his camouflage and burglary skills. He turned off the alarm and cameras, then carefully opened the garage doors. When he saw his target, a rare sports car, his heart began to beat faster. He knew that this would be one of the most difficult and risky thefts of his career. He quickly started the car using his knowledge of electronics and hacking. The car gave out a roar of the engine, and Dustin realized that he had little time. He left the garage and headed to a previously prepared shelter where he could hide and sell the car. However, on the way he noticed that he was being followed. One of the businessman's security guards, who did not notice the alarm was turned off, became suspicious and called the police. The chase began. Dustin masterfully drove the car, racing through the deserted night streets trying to escape pursuit. His experience and driving skills allowed him to elude the police, but he knew that this was not the end. He knew that now they were looking for him more actively, and each subsequent theft would become more and more dangerous. Dustin decided it was time to lay low for a while and use his connections to sell the car. He turned to an old friend, Mika, who was selling stolen cars abroad. Mika agreed to help, but warned that in such matters now one must be extremely careful. The car was sold and Dustin received a large sum of money. But instead of enjoying what he had earned, he felt that danger was always nearby. He knew that his life was a constant game with fate, and every new day could be his last. Dustin continued to steal cars, but now he acted even more carefully, choosing his targets carefully and avoiding unnecessary risks. He remained true to his principles and continued on his path, knowing that his skills and experience made him the best in the business. Dustin's story continues. He remains a car thief who skillfully evades justice and lives by his own rules in a world where every day is a new opportunity and a new challenge. Several weeks had passed since the last major theft, and Dustin lived quietly, avoiding unnecessary attention. He understood that every operation required careful preparation and planning. He managed to lie low and sell the stolen car abroad, providing himself with funds for some time. However, his criminal network was still operating, and Dustin continued to receive information about potential targets. One day, An old acquaintance named Rick approached him and told him about a new order. This time, the target was an exclusive limousine belonging to one of the influential politicians. Dustin knew it would be a difficult operation, but the reward was too tempting to refuse. He began to collect information about politics and his habits. The limousine was often used for official events and travel, and the security was top-notch. Dustin decided that the best time for the theft would be when the limousine was parked in one of the closed parking lots in the city center. Dustin and Rick came up with a plan. Rick took it upon himself to distract the guards while Dustin took care of the theft. On the day of the operation, Rick staged a small accident near the parking lot, distracting some of the guards. At this time, Dustin, disguised as a security officer, entered the parking lot and hacked the limousine's security system. He quickly started the car and drove out of the parking lot, trying not to attract attention. However, the guards quickly realized that something was wrong and gave chase. Dustin raced through the city streets, skillfully evading pursuit. Rick, following a pre-agreed plan, secured him in a pre-prepared car, creating additional obstacles for the guards. After an intense chase, Dustin finally managed to escape and headed to one of his safe hideouts outside the city. There he met with Rick and handed over the limousine for further transportation abroad. This time the operation was successful, and Dustin received a large sum of money. However, despite the successful hijacking, Dustin felt that the danger was not receding. The politician whose car was stolen had connections to powerful people, and now the hunt for Dustin became even more intense. Realizing that he needed to be even more careful, Dustin decided to pause his activities for a while and focus on safety. He changed several hiding spots, avoiding a fixed location, and used his camouflage skills to remain undetected. Every new day brought him new challenges, but Dustin was ready for them. His life continued to be a game on the edge, where every step could be the last. But despite all the dangers, Dustin remained true to himself and his craft. He knew that in a world where every day is a struggle for survival, his skills and experience make him the best. Dustin's story continues, and he is ready to face any challenge, knowing that only the most skillful and determined can survive in this cruel world. After successfully stealing a limousine and a temporary lull, Dustin realized that his reputation was again beginning to attract unnecessary attention. He decided that the time had come for an even more complex and risky undertaking to once again go into the shadows and ensure long-term peace of mind. One day, while watching the news, Dustin came across information about an upcoming auction of rare cars, which was to take place in one of the most luxurious hotels in the city. Among the cars up for auction was a unique model that Dustin had long dreamed of stealing, a legendary classic car that was valued at several $1,000,000. Dustin began preparing for surgery. He collected information about the hotel, security system, auction schedule, and personnel. He realized that for a successful theft he would need help, and turned to Rick, who has always been a reliable partner in such matters. The plan was developed in detail. Rick took it upon himself to distract the guards and create a distraction while Dustin was engaged in the theft. They decided to act the night before the auction, when the hotel would be less secure. On the day of the operation, Dustin and Rick arrived on site. Rick caused a small incident on the opposite side of the hotel, attracting the attention of the security guards. At this time, Dustin, dressed in a service staff uniform, got inside. He moved carefully, avoiding cameras and security posts. When he reached the showroom, he quickly turned off the alarm and picked the locks. When he saw his target, the legendary classic car, his heart began to beat faster. He knew he didn't have much time. After starting the car, Dustin carefully drove out of the showroom and headed towards the exit. Rick, following the plan, brought a truck into which they quickly loaded the car. Everything went smoothly, but suddenly, the backup alarm system went off and the guards began to pursue. Dustin and Rick raced through the night streets, avoiding police patrols and roadblocks. Thanks to Dustin's driving skills and Rick's tactical maneuvers, they managed to escape and reach a previously prepared shelter. The car was hidden and soon transported abroad through reliable channels. Having received a significant amount for the car he sold, Dustin decided that it was time to lay low again and reconsider his next steps. He understood that every successful operation increases the risk, and he needs to be even more careful. However, fate prepared a new challenge for him. One evening, while he was relaxing in his hideout, he received an anonymous message. It spoke of a large criminal organization interested in his services. This organization specialized in stealing luxury cars around the world and needed a man with his skills. Dustin knew this offer could be both an opportunity and a trap. He decided to do his research before making a decision. The meeting was scheduled on neutral territory, in one of the quiet bars on the outskirts of the city. When Dustin arrived at the scene, he saw a group of people who were clearly not simple robbers. They introduced themselves as representatives of an international network involved in the theft and sale of exclusive cars. The leader of the group, a man named Victor, offered Dustin a deal: cooperation in exchange for huge rewards and protection from the police. Dustin knew that this could be the beginning of a new, even more dangerous chapter in his life. He accepted the offer, realizing that his skills would now be in demand internationally. But he also understood that the game was becoming increasingly risky, and every step required the utmost caution. After meeting with Victor and his men, Dustin decided to accept their offer, seeing this as a chance to significantly increase his income and expand his criminal network. He understood that it would be dangerous, but he was ready for new challenges. The first task that Victor proposed was the theft of one of the most guarded cars in the country, a prototype of a new model of a sports car stored at the manufacturer's secret testing site. Dustin realized that this would not be just a hijacking, but a real test of his skills and ingenuity. He began by carefully examining the object. Victor provided him with all available data: plans of the training ground, schedule of guard shifts, security schemes. Dustin also received help from a team of professionals, including a hacker, a hacking specialist, and a driver. The plan was developed in detail. Dustin and his team had to sneak into the range at night, disable the security systems, and steal a car without attracting attention. The hacker had to break into the cameras and alarms. The burglary specialist had to disarm the locks and security systems, and Dustin and the driver had to steal the car themselves. On the night of the operation, the team gathered in an abandoned warehouse not far from the training ground. The hacker started by disabling cameras and breaking into security systems. Dustin and the burglary specialist entered, moving quietly and carefully. They quickly reached the garage where the car was stored. Using his skills, the burglary specialist disabled all of the car's security systems, and Dustin got behind the wheel. At this time, the driver prepared a truck into which they had to quickly load the car. Everything was going according to plan, but suddenly the backup security system was activated and an alarm began at the training ground. The guards began to converge on the garage and time was running out. Dustin quickly started the car and headed for the exit, and the burglary specialist followed him, covering his retreat. The truck driver pulled up to the pre-arranged location and they quickly loaded the truck. The chase began. The range security and the police, called by alarm, rushed after them. But thanks to Dustin's skill and the driver's precise instructions, they managed to evade pursuit and hide in one of the abandoned hangars on the outskirts of the city. The operation was successful and Dustin delivered the car to Victor. His skills and determination have proven themselves once again. Value, and Victor offered him permanent cooperation. But Dustin knew that every new success made him a target for enemies and authorities. Shortly after this operation, Dustin received information about a new, even more difficult task: the theft of a collector car from a private exhibition, which was to be held on a luxury yacht in international waters. This operation required not only the ability to steal cars, but also the skills of camouflage and planning. Dustin decided to take on the challenge. He prepared carefully, studying the layout of the yacht, security routes, and the event schedule. He knew that this operation would be one of the most risky in his career, but he was ready to go to the end. On the day of the exhibition, Dustin, disguised as a waiter, entered the yacht. He acted carefully, avoiding unnecessary glances and following a pre-prepared plan. When the time came, he snuck into the yacht's garage, where the collector's car was kept. Using his hacking skills, Dustin started the car and, choosing a moment when security was busy at the other end of the yacht, drove out onto the deck. He quickly lowered the car onto a prepared boat and headed towards the shore, avoiding patrols and police. The operation was a success, and Dustin once again proved that he is the best in the business. But he knew that with each new task his life became more and more dangerous. He continued to act carefully, knowing that only the most skillful and determined could survive in this cruel world. Dustin's story continues. He remains true to his craft, stealing the most expensive and protected cars, and every day brings him closer to new challenges and adventures. After a successful operation on the yacht, Dustin lay low again, carefully hiding his tracks and avoiding unnecessary attention. However, his reputation continued to grow, and increasingly powerful clients began to approach him, offering high-paying assignments. One of these clients was a famous crime boss named Marco, who invited Dustin to steal a unique armored SUV belonging to the head of a large crime syndicate. Dustin knew that this operation would be very risky, since the facility was protected by the best bodyguards and was equipped with the most modern security systems. However, he accepted the challenge, seeing it as a chance to further enhance his reputation and receive significant rewards. First of all, Dustin began collecting information about the SUV and its owner. He learned that the car was regularly used to travel to important meetings, and one of these meetings was to take place in a week in one of the most secure areas of the city. Dustin realized that he would need help, and again turned to Rick and other trusted partners. The plan was developed in detail. Dustin and his team decided to conduct the operation during the meeting, with security focused on securing the inside of the building. They prepared several diversionary maneuvers and carefully thought through every step. On the day of the operation, Dustin and his team took up positions around the building. Rick set off a diversionary explosion at the other end of the area to attract the attention of the police and security guards. At this time, Dustin entered the territory and hacked the security system of the SUV. He quickly started the car and headed towards the exit, but suddenly ran into a group of security guards. A shootout began. Dustin masterfully drove the car, dodging shots and making his way to freedom. His driving skills and composure allowed him to escape pursuit and reach a previously prepared shelter. At the shelter, Rick and the other team members were already waiting for him. They quickly dismantled the SUV to remove all possible traces and transported it to a safe location for further sale. Marco was pleased with the work done and generously rewarded Dustin and his team. However, despite the success of the operation, Dustin felt that his life was becoming increasingly dangerous. He understood that each new theft brought him closer to an inevitable fight with justice or competitors. He decided it was time to step away from the game for a while and reconsider his next steps. One evening, while Dustin was relaxing in his hideout, he received a message from an anonymous source. It spoke of a major conspiracy within the criminal world that could affect his interests. Dustin knew this could be either an opportunity or a trap, but he decided to look into the situation. After conducting his investigation, he found out that several influential crime bosses were planning to unite to eliminate the most successful and independent hijackers, including himself. Dustin realized that he was facing a serious test and began to prepare for possible attacks. He contacted Rick and other trusted partners to discuss a plan of action. They decided to be proactive exposing the conspiracy and eliminating key conspirators. Dustin knew it would be dangerous, but he had no other choice. First of all, they began to collect information about the meetings and plans of the conspirators. Using their connections and skills, they infiltrated their circles and began to act. In one of these operations, Dustin encountered a man who knew the elusive man and his methods. This encounter reminded him of his past and how dangerous the game he was playing could be. Dustin and his team continued to operate, eliminating one conspirator after another. But they knew that the most dangerous enemy was yet to come. They soon received information about the main meeting, where all the leaders of the conspiracy were to gather. This was the chance to deal a crushing blow and end the threat once and for all. On the night of the meeting, Dustin and his team infiltrated the meeting site. They acted quickly and decisively, neutralizing the guards and collecting evidence. When they reached the hall where the meeting was taking place, a fierce firefight ensued. Dustin knew this was his last chance. In the end, they were victorious. All the leaders of the conspiracy were neutralized, and Dustin transferred the collected evidence to the authorities through reliable channels to minimize the risk of his own exposure. He knew his actions would attract attention, but he was prepared for the consequences. Dustin's story continues. He remains in the shadows, continuing his dangerous game, knowing that every new day brings him new challenges and opportunities. His life is a constant struggle for survival in a world where trust is rare and betrayal is the norm. Several months have passed since Dustin exposed the conspiracy and eliminated its leaders. Now he lived in constant readiness for new challenges. Despite the successful operations and elimination of the main threats, Dustin understood that the criminal world does not forgive such actions. He needed to be one step ahead of his enemies. One evening, Dustin received an alarming message from one of his informants. The message contained information about a new player in the criminal world who was targeting him. This man, known as Victor the Shadow, was known for his ruthlessness and ability to find and destroy his enemies. Victor was determined to eliminate Dustin and seize control of the criminal network he had built. Dustin realized he needed to act quickly and decisively. He began collecting information about Victor, finding out his weak points and connections. Dustin also sought the help of Rick and other trusted partners to develop a plan to eliminate the new threat. The first step was to find and neutralize Victor's key allies. Dustin and his team began by infiltrating Victor's circles and gathering information about his closest associates. They began to act carefully, eliminating one by one in order to weaken Victor's position. One day, while spying on one of Victor's closest associates, Dustin learned of an important meeting at which Victor planned to discuss his next steps to seize control of the criminal network. This was the perfect opportunity for Dustin to land the finishing blow. The night of the meeting, Dustin and his team prepared for the operation. They entered the meeting place, an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Victor and his men were armed and preparing for battle. Dustin knew that this would be one of the most dangerous confrontations of his life. When the firefight began, Dustin and his team acted coordinatedly and decisively. They used their skills and tactics to crush the resistance of Victor and his men. In the midst of the fight, Dustin came face to face with Victor. The Shadow, like his nickname, was a fast and deadly opponent. A fierce battle ensued in which both understood that their lives were at stake. Dustin used all his skills and experience to defeat Victor. Finally, Dustin was able to knock Victor down and disarm him. He pinned Victor to the ground and said, "You thought you could take over everything I built? But you were wrong." With these words, he took the plunge and eliminated Victor. Taking control of the situation, Dustin and his team gathered all the evidence and quickly left the meeting place, knowing that their enemies would now be confused and afraid. After eliminating Victor the Shadow, Dustin realized that his path remained dangerous and unpredictable. Each new day brought new challenges and dangers, but he was ready for them. He knew that in a world where trust is rare and betrayal is the norm, only the most skillful and determined can survive. Dustin's story continues. He remains in the shadows, running his criminal network and evading justice, knowing that his skills and experience make him the best in the business. But he also understands that true peace and security will always be out of reach, and every new day is a new challenge. Several months have passed since the elimination of Victor Shadow. Dustin, despite the constant danger, still remained in the game. He managed to temporarily hide and lie low to analyze his next steps. He knew that the world of crime does not forgive weaknesses, and he needed to be ready for new challenges. One evening, as he sat in his hideout and looked through the latest news, an anonymous message arrived on his phone. It spoke of a new, high-risk order to steal a limousine belonging to an influential businessman who was suspected of money laundering and connections with the mafia. This limousine was not just a car, but a mobile fortress, equipped with the latest technology. Dustin understood that this order would bring him not only huge money, but also incredible risks. He decided that for such an operation he would need a new team of professionals. He contacted Rick and several other old acquaintances who had experience in such matters. First of all, they began to collect information about the businessman and his limousine. It turned out that the car is always accompanied by a security column and rarely leaves the territory of the mansion. Dustin decided that the best time to steal would be when the limousine was leaving the garage for another meeting. The plan was simple, but required extreme precision. Dustin and his team decided to stage an accident along the limousine's route in order to distract the guards and create confusion. They rented a van and loaded it with all the necessary equipment. On the day of the operation, Dustin and his team took up positions along the limousine route. As the car left the garage, Rick caused an accident involving a van, blocking the road. Security guards immediately surrounded the limousine, trying to understand what had happened. At that moment, Dustin, dressed in a traffic police uniform, rode up to the scene of the accident on a motorcycle. Using his skills and cunning, he entered the limousine through one of the back doors while the guards were busy investigating. Having taken possession of the limousine, Dustin quickly hacked into the control system and drove away from the scene, leaving the guards confused. A chase began, but thanks to a pre-planned route and dummy cars prepared by Rick, Dustin managed to elude pursuit. The limousine was hidden in a pre-prepared hangar where the team took it apart to make it impossible to track. The customer, satisfied with the work completed, generously rewarded Dustin and his team. However, despite the successful operation, Dustin knew that his position remained precarious. The world of crime is full of dangers, and each new order could be the last. He decided that it was time to lay low again and reconsider his next steps, knowing that sooner or later he would have to face new enemies and new challenges. Dustin's story continues. He remains in the shadows, controlling his own destiny and escaping justice, knowing that every day is a new game of survival. Several months have passed since the last operation, and Dustin decided that it was time for the riskiest and most ambitious robbery of his career. He knew that this step could be either a triumph or a disaster for him, but he was ready for the challenge. Dustin received information about the upcoming International Auto Show in Las Vegas, which will feature unique, expensive cars from around the world. Among them was one special exhibit, a prototype of a new model, created in a single copy and valued at tens of millions of dollars. This car was a real masterpiece of engineering and design, and its theft could bring Dustin not only huge money, but also unprecedented fame. He understood that such an operation would require a carefully thought-out plan and a team of the best specialists. Dustin contacted Rick and several other trusted people, including Hacker Charlie and a master of disguise named Alex. Each of them knew that the stakes were high, but they were ready to take risks. The first thing they did was gather information about the car show's location, security systems, and event schedule. They found out that the car would be stored in a special pavilion, surrounded by multi-level security and equipped with the most modern security systems. The robbery plan was worked out to the smallest detail. The team decided to act on the night before the opening of the car show, when the pavilion would be least guarded. Charlie took on the task of hacking security and video surveillance systems. Alex was supposed to provide a distraction for the guards, and Dustin and Rick were supposed to directly deal with the theft of the car. On the night of the operation, the team gathered in an abandoned warehouse near the car dealership. Charlie began by hacking the video surveillance systems and disabling the alarm in the desired pavilion. Alex, dressed in a security guard's uniform, entered the building and began to distract the real security guards, creating the appearance of technical problems. Dustin and Rick entered the dealership through the service entrance, which was temporarily disabled by Charlie. They quickly and silently reached the pavilion where the prototype was located. Using his hacking skills, Dustin disabled the vehicle's remaining security systems and prepared to steal it. When they started the car, the pavilion was filled with the muffled roar of the engine. They knew they didn't have much time. Dustin drove out of the pavilion, and Rick followed him in a prepared van. Alex, meanwhile, continued to distract the guards, creating interference and confusion. The chase began. Security guards and police, attracted by the noise, began to pursue Dustin and his team. But thanks to Dustin's driving skills and pre-planned routes, they were able to elude their pursuers and hide in a pre-prepared shelter outside the city. The car was hidden and prepared for further transportation abroad. Dustin and his team knew they now had to lay low and wait for the search to subside. The customer, impressed by their work, paid a huge reward, and each of them received their share. However, despite the successful robbery, Dustin knew the risk remained high. His name became more and more famous in criminal circles, and each new order could attract the attention of the authorities or competitors. He decided to temporarily disappear, changing his place of residence and identity in order to avoid possible persecution. But inside, he felt that his journey was not over yet. The world of crime always offered new challenges, and Dustin was ready for them. He continued to live in the shadows, using his skills and experience to survive and thrive in this cruel world. After a huge robbery at a car dealership, Dustin and his team temporarily lay low. They knew that such a risky and high-profile success would certainly attract the attention of the authorities, and they were not mistaken. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, began an active hunt for Dustin and his accomplices. FBI agents obtained numerous evidence and witness statements that pointed to Dustin's participation in the robbery. They soon began to narrow their search, collecting information about his possible hideouts and connections in the criminal world. Dustin realized that he had little time and decided to be proactive. One evening, while looking through his contacts, Dustin received an alarming message from one of his informants. The FBI was planning a large-scale operation to capture him, and agents were already close. Dustin knew that he urgently needed to leave his current location and find a new shelter. He contacted Rick and the rest of the team to warn them and discuss next steps. Everyone realized that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous and decided to split up to make it more difficult for the FBI to catch them. Dustin decided to go to a small town on the outskirts of the state, where he would not be looked for first. In his new hideout, Dustin began planning his next steps. He knew he had to find a way to put the FBI on the wrong track to buy time. To do this, he decided to use an old trick: create misinformation about his location and plans. Using his contacts, Dustin spread rumors that he was planning another major robbery in another state. These rumors quickly reached the FBI agents, and they began to redistribute their forces to catch Dustin in a new location. At this time, Dustin and his team were preparing for the next step. They decided to carry out a series of small operations to divert attention and confuse their pursuers. Every action was carefully thought out and executed with the utmost care. A few weeks later, the FBI, focusing on false leads, loosened control of key routes and hideouts. Dustin took advantage of this and began to move between different cities in order to completely confuse his pursuers. However, the FBI agents did not give up. They continued to analyze the data and eventually realized that they had become victims of misinformation. This gave Dustin and his team a slight head start, but they knew they had to act quickly and decisively. One day, when Dustin was in yet another hideout, an idea came to him on how to deal a serious blow to the FBI and at the same time ensure long-term safety for himself. He decided to break into one of their warehouses with confiscated evidence and destroy all evidence related to his crimes. For this operation, Dustin gathered his team and developed a detailed plan. They found out that the warehouse is located on the outskirts of the city and is guarded around the clock. Using their camouflage and hacking skills, the team entered the warehouse at night. Charlie hacked the security system and disabled the security cameras while Rick and Alex neutralized the guards. Dustin found a room with confiscated evidence and began looking for evidence related to his cases. Having found the necessary documents and records, he destroyed them, leaving the FBI without key evidence. When the operation was completed, the team quickly left the warehouse and returned to their hideout. Dustin knew that this would give them some time to breathe, but he also knew that the FBI wouldn't stop. He decided it was time to leave the country and start a new life abroad. Using false documents and his contacts, Dustin and his team left the United States and went to Europe. There they found new allies and began to build their criminal empire anew, but taking into account all past mistakes and lessons. Dustin's story continues. Now he operates internationally, escaping persecution and continuing his dangerous game. He knows that every new day is a new opportunity and a new challenge, and he is ready to face them. A few months after Dustin and his team left the United States, they successfully settled in Europe and began to rebuild their criminal empire. However, the FBI did not give up. The agents continued their investigation, following any clues that could lead them to Dustin. One day, the FBI managed to obtain important information from one of the informants who knew about Dustin's activities in Europe. This mafia informant was willing to cooperate with the FBI in exchange for protection and a reduced sentence. Thanks to his testimony, agents learned that Dustin had settled in one of the major cities and continued to engage in car thefts and other crimes. The FBI has developed a plan to capture Dustin. They decided to use his habits and methods against him. Agents began to monitor his movements, collecting information about his hideouts and contacts. They understood that a successful takeover would require careful preparation and coordinated work. One of the important steps was the introduction of an undercover agent into Dustin's circle. Agent Mike was chosen for this task, who had experience in the criminal environment and could easily join Dustin's team. Mike, using a false identity, began to make contacts and gradually gain the trust of Dustin and his men. Soon, Mike managed to penetrate Dustin's inner circle and find out about his plans for another major theft. This was the FBI's chance to mount a capture operation. Mike relayed the information to his superiors, and the agents began preparing for the operation. On the night of the hijacking, Dustin and his team gathered in an abandoned hangar on the outskirts of the city. They prepared carefully, checking equipment and discussing the details of the operation. At this point, Mike informed the FBI of the exact location and time of the operation. When Dustin and his men arrived at the scene of the theft, FBI agents were already ready. They set up roadblocks and prepared a capture team. Dustin, unaware of the threat, began to carry out his plan, but suddenly noticed something was wrong. He realized that they were surrounded. The FBI launched the operation with lightning speed. Having surrounded the hangar, agents used flashbang grenades to disorient the criminals. Dustin tried to escape, but the agents blocked all possible exits. A short firefight ensued, during which several members of Dustin's team were wounded and detained. Dustin, realizing that there was no way to escape, tried to hide in the building, but FBI agents quickly caught up with him. He was arrested and taken under strict escort to the local FBI office. Mike, who successfully completed his mission, was also evacuated and protected from possible reprisals from criminal circles. After Dustin's arrest, the FBI began conducting interviews to gather all possible information about his activities and connections. Thanks to the evidence collected and the testimony of other team members, Dustin was charged with numerous charges, including car theft, participation in an organized crime group, and resisting arrest. At the trial, which attracted enormous public attention, Dustin did not escape punishment. He was sentenced to a long prison term, and his criminal empire was destroyed. Dustin realized that his games with the law were over, and now he would have to spend many years behind bars. The story of Dustin, the legendary car thief, has come to an end. He found himself in the hands of justice, but his name will forever remain in criminal chronicles as one of the most skillful and daring criminals of his time. After Dustin's arrest and conviction, his crew's lives changed forever. Rick, Charlie, and Alex, despite the arrests, were able to avoid long sentences thanks to plea deals. They decided to leave the criminal world forever and start a new life, away from old connections and dangers. Dustin, once behind bars, knew that his days as a free man were over. He often reflected on what brought him to this end: risk, adrenaline, and constant play on the edge. Now he had a lot of time to think. In prison, Dustin faced new challenges. He quickly realized that even here his reputation preceded him. Some prisoners respected him for his skill and audacity, while others saw him as a threat. But Dustin decided to behave calmly and not attract unnecessary attention to himself. Over time, he found ways to use his skills to help other prisoners. He became a consultant of sorts, helping to develop plans and solve problems, but with no intention of breaking the law again. His experience and knowledge became useful to others, and this helped him find his place in the new world. Once free, Rick, Charlie, and Alex began to build their new lives. Rick opened an auto repair shop using his knowledge and skills for legal purposes. Charlie found work at a cybersecurity company, using his hacking skills to protect systems. Alex became a private detective, helping people solve their problems and search for missing people. One day, Rick, Charlie, and Alex got together to reminisce about old times and talk about the future. They knew their lives would never be the same, but they also knew they had made the right choice. They often remembered Dustin and hoped that he would find his way even behind bars. Years passed, and Dustin, despite all the difficulties, was able to find his place in prison. He became a mentor to young prisoners, helping them avoid the mistakes that landed him in prison. His stories of past deeds became legendary, and he was respected by many for his wisdom and experience. One day, many years later, Dustin received a letter from Rick. It talked about how the three of them were able to start a new life, and how grateful they were for everything they had been through together. The letter became a source of comfort for Dustin, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, light can be found. Dustin's story didn't end the way he imagined, but he found his path and meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. He remains in the memory of those who knew him as a legendary car thief and a man who, despite all his mistakes, found a way to make his life meaningful. Second story of the criminal. Small town in the middle of America, 1990s. Quiet street with houses in a row. The sunset is visible in the background, creating a feeling of calm and warmth. Inside a modest but cozy house. In the living room, photographs of family holidays hang on the walls. Little Johnny, a 6-year-old boy, quiet and thoughtful, plays with toy cars on the carpet. His mother, a young woman with kind eyes, is preparing dinner in the kitchen. Every now and then she glances at Johnny and smiles. Suddenly Johnny's father bursts into the house. He is clearly not in the mood. His face is distorted with anger. Johnny quickly puts the toys away, trying not to attract attention to himself. Johnny's dad yells at Johnny's mom, accusing her of something minor. Johnny watches the scene, his face tense. Mom tries to calm her father down, but he doesn't let up. Johnny stands up and heads towards the door. He leaves the house and sits on the porch, trying to get away from the noise and screams inside. It's quiet outside. You can only hear the wind rustling the leaves. Several years pass. Johnny is already a teenager. He sits at the back of the classroom staring out the window. The teacher explains something, but Johnny doesn't listen. His thoughts are far away. During recess, Johnny goes out into the schoolyard. He stays away from other children, trying not to attract attention to himself. Suddenly, several older boys come up to him and start mocking him. Johnny doesn't answer, but his eyes sparkle with determination. After school, Johnny goes home. On the way, he notices how the same older boys are pestering a small child. Johnny, without hesitation, runs up and stands up for him. A fight ensues. Johnny goes home with cuts and bruises on his face. He knows that he may get a scolding for his actions, but in his heart he feels that he did the right thing. When he comes home, his mother sees his condition and asks worriedly what happened. Johnny briefly replies that he was just getting into a fight. She carefully treats his wounds without asking unnecessary questions. Years pass. Johnny is getting older and stronger. He is no longer afraid of older boys. He is respected and feared by the whole school. He makes several loyal friends with whom he spends time. However, Johnny continues to stay away, preferring loneliness and silence. One day, while returning home, Johnny notices a man on the street whom he has never seen before. He stands by a parked car and carefully examines something. Suddenly, the man turns around and stares at Johnny. There is a silent exchange of glances between them, which lasts only a couple of seconds but leaves a deep mark on Johnny's soul. That night, Johnny can't sleep. He thinks he sees that person's face every time he closes his eyes. Questions begin to swarm in your head. Who is he? What was he doing on their street, and why was he looking at him so intently? The next day, Johnny decides to take a walk around the city. He goes to the park, where he often spends time watching people. Again, the same stranger attracts his attention. This time he sits on a bench and reads a newspaper. Johnny decides to get closer and pretend he's just passing by. The stranger lifts his head and looks at Johnny again, but this time he smiles and nods in greeting. Johnny is confused, but nods in response and moves on. Several weeks pass, and Johnny notices that the stranger has begun to appear frequently in the places where he goes. At first, Johnny is alarmed by this, but over time he begins to get used to his presence. One day, having finally decided to find out what is going on, Johnny approaches him and directly asks why he is pursuing him. The stranger, who introduces himself as Victor, explains that he works for one of the local private security companies and noticed how Johnny stood up for a small child. He was impressed by his courage and strength and wants to offer him the opportunity to work together. Victor tells Johnny about how he himself grew up in similar conditions and was able to find his place in life thanks to the right mentors. Johnny listens to Victor, and something changes in his soul. He feels that this person can really help him. Victor invites Johnny to meet with his mentor, the man who once helped him find the right path himself. Johnny agrees, and this meeting becomes a turning point in his life. Victor makes an appointment at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Johnny arrives early, feeling nervous and tense. He sits down at a table by the window and carefully watches the entrance. A few minutes later, Victor enters, accompanied by a tall man in a formal suit with a piercing gaze. They approach Johnny, and Victor introduces the man as Alex. Alex sits down opposite Johnny and carefully studies him with his eyes. Victor begins to tell the story of how Alex helped him find his path and become who he is today. Johnny listens without interrupting and feels his interest in the man growing. Alex starts talking. His voice is calm and confident. He talks about how he sees potential in Johnny and is willing to help him develop his skills. Alex explains that he has a school where he teaches young men like Johnny discipline, strategy, and the ability to protect themselves and others. Johnny, although a little skeptical, agrees to try. Over the next few months, he begins attending classes at Alex's school. Here he meets other young people, each of whom has their own story and their own reasons for being here. Johnny immerses himself in training that includes not only physical training, but also lessons in tactics, psychology, and ethics. Alex becomes not only a mentor for Johnny, but also the father figure he so lacked. It teaches him not only to fight, but also to think ahead, assess situations, and make the right decisions. Gradually, Johnny begins to change. His skills are growing, and with them comes confidence in himself and his abilities. One day, after another training session, Alex invites Johnny to take part in the first real task. It's a simple security job, but for Johnny, it's an important step forward. He agrees and goes on a mission with Victor. Everything goes smoothly, and for the first time, Johnny feels like he has found his place in life. However, despite his successes, there remains a feeling in Johnny's soul that something more awaits him. He is drawn to the world he finds himself in, but he also understands that this path may lead him to dangerous and difficult decisions. Alex, seeing this, begins to gradually introduce Johnny into more complex and responsible tasks, each time testing his strength and moral principles. On one of these missions, Johnny encounters a situation that forces him to rethink everything he has learned. He has to make a choice that will change his life forever. Several years pass. Johnny becomes famous in criminal circles due to his skills and composure. His reputation grows, and one day he is approached by representatives of a powerful mafia organization. They invite Johnny to join their ranks, promising him protection and great opportunities. Johnny realizes that this could be his chance to take things to the next level, but he also realizes that this is an extremely dangerous path. He accepts the offer and becomes part of the mafia. His new boss, Don Salvatore, turns out to be a tough and ruthless leader, but he sees great potential in Johnny and quickly promotes him through the ranks. Johnny's first task in the mafia is to eliminate a competitor who is interfering with Salvatore's business. Johnny successfully completes the task, demonstrating his professionalism and cold calculation. With each new assignment, he becomes more and more immersed in the world of the mafia, becoming an integral part of the organization. Over time, Johnny begins to realize that his new life is full not only of money and power, but also of danger, betrayal, and moral dilemmas. He faces situations where he has to choose between his personal beliefs and loyalty to the mafia. One day, Johnny is assigned a difficult task: to eliminate a man who was once his friend. He understands that this is a test of his loyalty. Meeting this man becomes a serious test for Johnny. He must decide whether he is ready to completely abandon his past life and all moral principles for the sake of his new position. Johnny meets up with a former friend in a dark alley. They exchange a few words, and Johnny feels conflicting emotions fighting inside him. His friend tries to convince Johnny that this path will lead to his death and that it is not too late to change everything. However, Johnny realizes that there is no way out. He must carry out the order. With a heavy heart, he does what is asked of him, but after that he begins to doubt his choice. His internal struggle becomes more and more obvious, and he begins to look for a way out of the mafia circle. Johnny begins to plan his escape from the mafia, realizing that it will be extremely difficult and dangerous. He finds allies among those who also want to escape Salvatore's control. Together they develop a plan, but Johnny realizes that any wrong step could cost him his life. The climax comes when Johnny must face Salvatore himself. He understands that this will be their last fight, and only one of them will come out of it alive. Johnny and his allies begin to carefully plan their escape. They understand that any wrong move could attract the attention of Don Salvatore and lead to their inevitable death. Every day passes in tension, Every step is like walking into a minefield. One evening, Johnny gathers with several trusted people in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Among them are Victor, his old mentor, and several members of the mafia, who are also tired of living under constant threat. They discuss the escape plan, dividing responsibilities and agreeing on details. The plan consists of several stages. First, they must destroy all evidence that might indicate their involvement in the mafia. They then plan to fake their deaths to lead the mafia on the wrong trail. After this, Johnny and his people intend to disappear, each in their own direction, and start a new life. But Johnny's plans are ruined when one of his allies turns out to be a traitor and informs Don Salvatore of his impending escape. Salvatore immediately orders the capture of Johnny and his men. A surprise attack at a warehouse leads to a brutal shootout. Johnny and his remaining allies fight for their lives but realize their chances of success are slim. Johnny manages to escape, but loses several of his men in the battle. With a heavy heart, he continues to hide, knowing that now not only the mafia is hunting him, but also the police, whom Salvatore bribed. He realizes that his life will never be the same again. He finds refuge in an old house on the outskirts of the city. There, alone, he begins to think about his next steps. He understands that the only way to stop this hunt is to eliminate Don Salvatore himself. Johnny decides he must take matters into his own hands and strike first. He begins to collect information about Salvatore's habits and routes. Johnny uses all his connections to get accurate information about the location of Don and his guards. He plans an attack that will be his most dangerous and risky mission yet. Johnny sneaks into the Salvatore mansion under cover of darkness. He moves quietly and carefully, avoiding guards and surveillance cameras. He knows he only has one chance. There is silence inside the mansion, broken only by the occasional step of security. Johnny approaches Salvatore's office. When he finally comes face to face with Don, they have a short and tense conversation. Salvatore laughs, confident of his victory, but Johnny remains cool. At the decisive moment, he delivers a precise blow that takes Salvatore's life. Weeks have passed since Johnny killed Don Salvatore and disappeared. The police began an investigation, but despite all their efforts, they could not find a trace. Johnny skillfully hid all his tracks, using his knowledge and skills acquired over the years in the mafia. The police are interviewing all possible witnesses, but no one knows where Johnny is. Some believe that he left the country. Others suggest that he is hiding somewhere in the city. Detective Mark Raymond, an experienced investigator, takes on the case. He begins to carefully study all the details, trying to understand Johnny's motives and logic. Mark visits places where Johnny once visited, talks with his former acquaintances and partners. He begins to put the puzzle together, but the key piece is still missing. Meanwhile, Johnny changes his appearance and moves from place to place, always one step ahead of the police. One day, during a search in one of the abandoned buildings, Mark finds an old notebook that belonged to one of Johnny's allies. It contains seemingly insignificant entries, but one of them attracts the detective's attention. The notebook mentions a certain quiet house on the outskirts of the city, a place that Mark did not know about before. Mark decides to check this place out. He goes there late at night, trying not to attract attention. The quiet house turns out to be abandoned and, at first glance, empty. But after searching it, Mark finds a cache of weapons and ammunition. This confirms that someone has been here recently. Meanwhile, Johnny observes the actions of the police from afar. He understands that Mark is a serious and skillful opponent, and that he needs to be even more careful. Johnny decides to create a false trail to lead the police in the other direction. He leaves several clues indicating that he plans to leave town by train. Mark and his team follow this trail but quickly realize that they have been deceived. Johnny, meanwhile, continues to move around, using his connections to stay safe. He understands that sooner or later the police will be able to get on his trail, so he decides to prepare a backup plan. Johnny contacts Victor, who has remained in the shadows all this time. Victor offers help and refuge abroad, but Johnny doesn't want to leave the country. Instead, he decides to meet with Victor to discuss his options. The meeting takes place in an old abandoned warehouse where they once planned their escape. Victor offers Johnny the opportunity to hide in one of the remote regions of the country, where he has reliable people. Johnny agrees, realizing that this may give him time to consider his next steps. He thanks Victor for his help and sets off. Meanwhile, Mark doesn't give up. He begins to realize that Johnny is acting with the help of some of his old connections. Mark decides to change tactics and begins to follow those who were once close to Johnny. He hopes this will lead him to the right clue. Johnny finds refuge in a small town far from large cities. He tries to start a new life, but always remains on guard. Johnny found a quiet and secluded place in a small town. A house on the outskirts, surrounded by forest, became his refuge. Here, he could remain unnoticed, live a simple life, and consider his next steps. Time passed, and Johnny tried not to attract attention to himself. He took temporary jobs, worked part-time in local stores and farms, changing places and not staying anywhere for long. Several months have passed. The police, despite Mark's efforts, gradually stopped active searches, switching to other cases. Mark, however, did not give up trying to find Johnny, confident that he was somewhere nearby. One evening, as Johnny was sitting on the porch of his house, the local postman approached him and handed him an envelope without a return address. Inside was a note. "We know where you are. Be careful." Johnny immediately realized that someone had found him. He quickly began to pack his things, realizing that he needed to leave this place immediately. While Johnny was getting ready, he heard a car. Through the window, he saw a car drive up to the house. Two men, clearly not locals, came out. Johnny realized that he did not have time to escape. He quickly hid in the basement, holding his weapon at the ready. The men entered the house and began to search it. Johnny watched them through a small hole in the floor. He understood that these could either be people from the mafia or mercenaries sent to eliminate him. As the men approached the basement, Johnny jumped out from his hiding place, quickly and silently eliminating them both. Realizing that his hiding place was no longer safe, Johnny decided to move on. He used the car the men arrived in to leave town. On the way, he thought about who could find him and how. Apparently, someone very well connected was still looking for him. Johnny headed to another city, this time even more remote and little known. There he found an abandoned house in the forest which became his new refuge. He changed his appearance again, making it even less noticeable, and became even more careful. Johnny understood that he needed not only to hide, but also to find out who continued to pursue him and why. Several months have passed in the new location. Johnny began to organize his life again, but this time he was prepared for possible troubles. He contacted Victor, who was still his only reliable ally. Victor said that rumors about Johnny are still circulating, but there is no longer an active search. However, Johnny couldn't relax. He felt that he could be in danger again at any moment. He continued to train, stay in shape, and prepare for possible threats. He knew his life would never be the same, but he was ready to fight for his future. Johnny continued to live in hiding, but remained on alert, ready for new challenges. He managed to establish connections with local criminal elements in order to have resources and information at his fingertips. He knew that help could be needed at any moment and was ready to pay for it. One evening, when Johnny returned home, he found a note on the table. "Your life is still in danger. Contact Victor immediately." Johnny realized that someone had broken into his house, but did not take anything. This alarmed him. He contacted Victor, who arranged a meeting for him in an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. When Johnny arrived at the scene, Victor was already waiting for him. He looked worried and nervous. Victor explained that he had learned about a new threat. The group, working for the remaining members of the mafia, hired professional killers to finish off Johnny. They knew he was hiding somewhere in this area and they were going to find him at any cost. Johnny and Victor decided to be proactive. They began looking for information about the killers and found out that their base was located in an abandoned industrial area. Johnny and Victor decide to strike first. At night, Johnny and Victor go to an industrial area. They move quietly and carefully so as not to attract attention. Having found the killer's base, they see that the building is well guarded. Johnny develops a plan of attack. They decide to split up. Victor will distract the guards and Johnny will get inside and eliminate the leaders. Victor launches a diversion by setting one of the warehouses nearby on fire. The guards rush to put out the fire, giving Johnny the opportunity to enter the building. He moves quietly, eliminating the guards one by one until he reaches the main office. There he encounters the leader of a group of killers, an experienced and brutal fighter named Marco. A violent fight ensues between Johnny and Marco. Marco proves a worthy opponent, but Johnny uses his experience and skills to gain the upper hand. He emerges victorious, but realizes that this is just the beginning. His enemies will not stop until they destroy him. After destroying the killer's base, Johnny and Victor realize that they now need to find and eliminate those who ordered the murder. They begin to search for information about the remaining members of the mafia, trying to act quickly and efficiently. Johnny and Victor are on the trail of one of the mafia bosses, Carlo, who recently moved to the city and established his own rules. Carlo is cruel and ruthless, running a large drug and weapons trafficking network. Johnny decides that his next target is Carlo. With Victor's help, Johnny infiltrates Carlo's lair, located in a luxurious mansion in the city center. They decide to act cunningly, infiltrating the ranks of Carlo's people under the guise of new mercenaries. Victor obtains fake documents and arranges a meeting with one of Carlo's trusted people. Johnny and Victor begin working for Carlo, collecting information about his plans and routes. They learn that Carlo is preparing a major arms deal and decide to use this moment to strike. They plan to ruin the deal, kill Carlo, and destroy his organization. On the appointed day, Johnny and Victor, along with the rest of Carlo's people, go to make a deal. Everything goes according to plan until Johnny decides to take action. At the right moment, he and Victor launch an attack, eliminating the guards and blowing up the weapons warehouse. Chaos ensues, and in the chaos, Johnny finds Carlo. The final fight takes place between them. Johnny realizes that this is his chance to put an end to this mafia network once and for all. He fights Carlo using all his skills and experience. Finally, Johnny wins, eliminating Carlo and destroying his empire. But Johnny realizes that his struggle does not end there. He knows that there will always be new enemies, and he will have to be on alert. However, now, with Victor's support, he is ready for whatever the future brings. After eliminating Carlo and destroying his empire, Johnny and Victor realize that a new stage is beginning in their lives. Despite successfully taking down one of the mob bosses, they realize they must deal with the consequences of their actions. The remaining members of the mafia begin to unite to avenge Carlo and regain lost ground. The police, having learned about Carlo's death and the ruin of his organization, intensify the investigation. Mark Raymond, not losing hope of finding Johnny, uses all available resources to get on his trail. He realizes that Johnny is not acting alone and that he has a powerful ally. Mark decides to monitor all suspicious movements in the criminal world, hoping to find a clue. Meanwhile, Johnny and Victor continue to strengthen their positions. They know that the next attack could happen at any moment. Johnny contacts other former allies who are willing to help in their fight. They form a small but effective team, ready for any challenge. One night, while Johnny and Victor were discussing their future plans, they receive a message from one of their informants. A group of mercenaries with ties to the mafia are sent to the city to destroy them. Johnny and Victor decide to be proactive. They ambush the mercenaries in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. Victor and Johnny carefully prepare for the attack, setting traps and placing people in key positions. When the mercenaries arrive, a fierce firefight ensues. Johnny and his team fight desperately, knowing that their lives depend on it. After a long and grueling battle, Johnny and his men are victorious. However, they understand that this is just the beginning. The Mafia will not stop until it destroys them completely. Johnny decides that they must strike at the very roots of the Mafia network. Johnny and Victor begin an investigation to find out who is behind all the latest attacks. They discover that the true leader of the Mafia, a man named Don Luigi, runs all operations from abroad. Don Luigi is a cunning and ruthless mafioso, known for his brutal methods. Johnny and Victor decide to go abroad to find and eliminate Don Luigi. They know this will be their most dangerous mission yet, but they are willing to risk everything for the ultimate victory. Using their connections and resources, they begin to plan the operation. Arriving in Europe, Johnny and Victor begin to collect information about Don Luigi. They penetrate his surroundings, trying not to attract attention. They manage to find out that Don Luigi is hiding in a fortified villa on the coast of Italy. Johnny and Victor decide to attack the villa at night when security will be minimal. On the night of the attack, Johnny and his team sneak up to the villa, using the darkness as cover. They quietly eliminate the guards and get inside. Johnny realizes that this is their only chance. He finds Don Luigi in his office and enters into a brutal fight with him. Don Luigi turns out to be an experienced and strong opponent, but Johnny, using all his skills and experience, defeats him. He understands that with the elimination of Don Luigi, the Mafia network will be completely destroyed. However, he also realizes that his life will never be the same. After returning to the United States, Johnny and Victor realize that they have changed the criminal world forever. They have become legends, but at the same time their lives are now full of constant danger. They decide to continue fighting the remaining criminal elements, knowing that this is their path and their destiny. After returning to the United States, Johnny and Victor decide to lay low for a while to consider their next steps. They understand that in the world of crime there will always be new threats and new enemies. At the same time, they cannot live in constant fear that someone will find them and destroy them. Victor finds shelter for them on the border with Mexico, a small house in the mountains surrounded by dense forest. Here, they spend several months analyzing everything that happened and planning their further actions. Johnny continues to train, keeping himself in excellent shape, ready for any eventuality. Meanwhile, big changes are beginning in the criminal world. After the death of Don Luigi and the destruction of his empire, other mafia groups try to fill the resulting power vacuum. A war for territory and influence begins in the city, which attracts the attention of the police and the media. Detective Mark Raymond, despite the temporary lull, continues to monitor events. He realizes that Johnny is still alive and that he may be playing an important role in these changes. Mark begins to collect information about the new mafia leaders, hoping to get on Johnny's trail through them. One day, Victor receives a message from one of his old contacts. He reports that a new mafia group, led by a certain Antonio Rossi, has begun to gain strength and plans to restore the old order. Rossi is known for his cruelty and ambition, and Victor realizes that this could be a serious threat. Johnny and Victor decide that they must stop Rossi before he becomes too powerful. They begin to collect information about his activities and plans. Using their connections and resources, they find several key people around Rossi who can help them undermine his influence from within. One evening, Johnny and Victor go to meet one of the informants. It should be a quiet and safe place, but things don't go according to plan. They are attacked by Rossi's men and a fierce firefight ensues. Johnny and Victor struggle with despair, realizing that their lives are once again hanging in the balance. They manage to survive and escape, but they realize that Rossi now knows about them and will pursue them. Johnny and Victor decide to change tactics and go on the offensive. They begin attacking Russia's warehouses and logistics centers, disrupting his operations and reducing his influence. Meanwhile, Mark Raymond receives new information about Johnny. He realizes that Johnny and Victor are waging their own war against Rossi and decides that this might be his chance to finally catch them. He begins to follow Rossi's actions, hoping that this will lead him to Johnny. Johnny and Victor learn that Rossi is planning a major drug operation in the city. They decide this is their chance to strike the decisive blow. They develop a plan of attack, intending to destroy the entire cargo and deal a serious blow to Russia's finances. On the night of the operation, Johnny and Victor make their way to the rendezvous point. They plant explosives around the warehouse in preparation for an attack. At this moment, Mark Raymond and his team also approach the site, hoping to catch Rossi and possibly Johnny. When the operation begins, things don't go according to plan. Unexpected guests arrive at the place, another mafia group that decided to interfere in Russia's affairs. Chaos ensues, and in the chaos, Johnny and Victor find themselves face to face with Mark. A short but intense conversation ensues between them. Mark realizes that Johnny and Victor are not ordinary criminals, and that their goals may be the same. He proposes a temporary truce to deal with Rossi and his men. Johnny, realizing that this may be his only chance, agrees. They team up and deliver a powerful blow to Rossi, destroying his cargo and seriously weakening his influence. However, Rossi manages to escape, and Johnny realizes that their battle is not over yet. Now they have a temporary ally in Mark, but they cannot trust him completely. Johnny, Victor, and Mark decide that their next goal is to find and destroy Rossi once and for all. They understand that this will be dangerous, but they are ready to take risks in order to finally get rid of the threat and try to start a new life. Johnny, Victor, and Mark decide that their only chance to destroy Rossi is to deliver a surprise and devastating blow. They begin to gather information about his whereabouts and plans. Victor uses his connections in the criminal world, and Mark uses police resources to collect data. They find out that Rossi is hiding in one of his secret villas on the coast. The operation to eliminate Rossi requires careful preparation. Johnny and Victor are studying all possible ways to enter the villa and developing a detailed plan of attack. Mark, for his part, provides police support so that the operation goes smoothly and without unnecessary complications. The night of the attack arrives. Johnny, Victor, and their team enter the villa using underground tunnels, which they learned about thanks to an informant. They act quickly and silently, eliminating the guards and advancing towards the main building. Meanwhile, Mark and his group block all exits and approaches to the villa to prevent Rossi from escaping. They are ready to intervene if necessary, but try to keep a low profile so as not to attract attention until the decisive moment. Johnny and Victor enter the main house. They know that Rossi is well guarded, but they are counting on the effect of surprise. When they enter the office, Rossi is already waiting for them, surrounded by his bodyguards. A brutal shootout ensues. Johnny and Victor use all their skills and tactics to cope with superior enemy forces. They move quickly and decisively, delivering precise strikes. Victor covers Johnny, who makes his way closer to Rossi. Meanwhile, Mark and his men engage the outer guards, preventing them from coming to the rescue. When Johnny finally comes face to face with Rossi, a violent fight ensues between them. Rossi, an experienced fighter, proves to be a strong opponent, but Johnny, driven by determination and anger for everything Rossi has done, defeats him in a tense battle. With their victory over Rossi, Johnny and Victor realize that they have taken the first step towards a new life. They leave the villa, where Mark meets them. The police complete the operation, arresting the remaining members of Rossi's gang and confiscating his property. Despite their success, Johnny and Victor realize that their lives are still full of dangers. They thank Mark for his help and warn him that there is no long peace in their world. Mark, in turn, acknowledges that sometimes justice requires unconventional solutions and promises to keep them under review but not interfere unnecessarily. Despite the success of the operation against Rossi, Johnny, Victor, and Mark realize that the enemies have not disappeared. Rival mafia groups begin to see them as a threat and join forces to eliminate the new threat. Johnny, Victor, and Mark remain in their new hideout, but soon receive information that several powerful mafia leaders have gathered together to destroy them. Johnny decides to strengthen security measures and develops a protection plan, but realizes that staying in one place for a long time will be dangerous. One night, as they discuss their next steps, Victor receives a call from one of his old friends. He reports that their location has been revealed and that the enemies are already close. Victor immediately reports this to Johnny and Mark. They decide to immediately leave the shelter and split up to increase their chances of survival. Mark and Victor are heading to one of the nearest cities where they have reliable contacts. Johnny goes in the opposite direction, hoping to confuse his tracks and gain time. They agree to meet in a few days at a pre-agreed place. When Victor and Mark arrive in town, they immediately sense that something is wrong. Their contact is not communicating and the streets seem too quiet. They decide to proceed with caution, but their plan is ruined when they are attacked. A shootout ensues, during which Victor and Mark heroically fight, but realize that there are too many opponents. Mark is mortally wounded, but manages to warn Johnny via phone that they are ambushed. Victor continues to fight, but soon also dies trying to protect Mark. Johnny, having received the message, realizes that his friends have died and that he is left alone again. Johnny hides in the woods, knowing that he is now being hunted. He understands that competitors will not stop until they find and destroy him. Using his skills and instincts, he continues to move, trying not to leave a trace. Days pass, and Johnny, despite the pain of loss, plans his next steps. He decides that the only way to survive is to strike first. He begins to collect information about the leaders of the mafia groups who are hunting him. Johnny realizes that this will be a deadly game, but he has no choice. He contacts the remaining trusted people to get support and resources. Johnny prepares for his final battle, knowing his life is on the line. He decides to launch a series of attacks on mafia leaders in order to destabilize their organization and eliminate the main threats. Johnny's first target is the main leader of the mafia, known for his cruelty and cunning. Johnny develops a plan of attack using all his knowledge and experience. He sneaks into a mafia boss's hideout and causes an explosion that destroys him and his inner circle. With each successful attack, Johnny becomes more and more confident in his abilities. He understands that now he has a chance not only to survive, but also to finally finish off his enemies. Johnny continues his mission, knowing that he is doing this not only for himself, but also in memory of his fallen friends, Victor and Mark. One day, in one of his hideouts, Johnny receives a message from his old friend Victor. He reveals that the last group of enemies are planning a major operation, and that Johnny has the opportunity to strike the decisive blow. Johnny gathers his remaining strength and prepares for the final battle. Johnny understands that a fierce battle awaits him ahead, but he is ready to meet his enemies face to face. Deep down, he knows that this battle will be his last, but he is ready for it, knowing that the fight for justice and for the memory of his friends is worth it. After the final battle, in which Johnny destroyed the last mafia leaders, he realized that his mission was not over yet. He realized that behind many of his enemies was a powerful and wealthy businessman who financed criminal operations and used the mafia to achieve his goals. This man remained in the shadows, avoiding direct confrontation, but now Johnny knew that he had to end him in order to completely clear his life of threats. Johnny began to collect information about a businessman whose name was Michael Corbett. Corbett was known for his impeccable reputation in the business world, but behind this mask there were dark deeds. Johnny learned that Corbett controlled a significant portion of the illegal business in the country, including the arms and drug trade. Johnny knew that killing such an influential man would require careful preparation and secrecy. He began to develop a plan using all his resources and connections. The first step was to assemble a team consisting of reliable people who also had reasons to hate Corbett and his empire. Johnny contacted former allies Victor and Mark, who remained loyal to him and were ready to help in this dangerous mission. They began to observe Corbett, studying his habits and routes. Johnny knew that Corbett was closely guarded and any wrong move could lead to failure. One day, Johnny received information that Corbett was planning to hold a major business meeting on his private island. It was an ideal place for an attack, away from the bustle of the city, with a minimum number of guards. Johnny and his team began planning the operation, realizing they would only have one chance. Johnny decided to go undercover. He used his connections to create a cover story, a fictitious identity of a successful businessman who could interest Corbett with his proposals. Using false documents and an elaborate story, he was able to infiltrate Corbett's inner circle. At the meeting, Johnny and his team infiltrated the island using boats and diving equipment. They installed hidden cameras and microphones to monitor the movements of Corbett and his guards. Johnny acted calmly and professionally, despite the danger of the situation. On the day of the meeting, Johnny, disguised as a businessman, entered into negotiations with Corbett. They talked about various business projects, and Corbett, fascinated by his new partner, was unaware of Johnny's real intentions. Meanwhile, Johnny's team was preparing to attack. As the negotiations reached their climax, Johnny received a signal from his team. He knew that the time had come to act. He suddenly pulled out a weapon and pointed it at Corbett, declaring that it was time to pay for all his crimes. Corbett's security attempted to intervene, but Johnny's team was already in position and beginning to neutralize the threats. A fierce fight ensued between Johnny and Corbett. Corbett, despite his age, turned out to be a strong and cunning opponent. They fought for life and death, and at that moment Johnny realized that this battle was not only for his freedom, but also for the memory of Victor and Mark. In the end, Johnny managed to gain the upper hand. Corbett was defeated, and his criminal empire began to crumble. Johnny and his team destroyed all evidence of their presence on the island and disappeared, leaving behind a destroyed empire and intimidated accomplices. After eliminating Corbett, Johnny and his team went into hiding, but realized that they needed to clear their tracks as quickly as possible. In the world of crime, rumors spread quickly, and those associated with Corbett began to panic. Johnny understood that in the near future they might try to eliminate them in order to cover their tracks. Johnny contacted his remaining allies and suggested they continue the hunt for those who supported Corbett's business. They compiled a list of targets, influential people, politicians, and businessmen who profited from criminal activities. Each of them was involved in illegal operations and posed a threat to Johnny's new life. The first target is Senator Gregory Lewis, who used his position to cover up Corbett's criminal activities. Johnny and his team began tracking Lewis, studying his habits and routes. They found out that the senator often visits a closed club, where he holds meetings with business partners. They decided to act on the night Lewis was planning a major meeting. Johnny and his men entered the club under the guise of service staff. They installed hidden cameras and microphones to record evidence of the criminal activities of Lewis and his associates. When the meeting began, Johnny and his team blocked all exits and began the takeover. The club began to panic, but the team acted quickly and decisively. They neutralized the security and gathered everyone in one room. Johnny stepped forward and announced that it was payback time. Lewis tried to persuade Johnny to let him go, offering money and connections, but Johnny was adamant. He knew that these people deserved to be punished for their crimes. Johnny showed them the evidence he had collected and threatened to make it public if anyone tried to stand in his way again. Johnny and his team then disappeared, leaving chaos and fear in their wake. Lewis and his partners knew that they were now under close surveillance, and any mistake they made would be used against them. The next target is major drug dealer Carlos Mendoza. He controlled most of the drug supply into the region and was linked to Corbett through a complex network of intermediaries. Johnny and his team began planning an attack on his laboratory, located deep in the jungle. Getting into the laboratory was not easy. It was heavily guarded with many traps and security systems. Johnny used his connections to gain information about the complex internal structure. They developed a plan to sneak in and destroy the drug production. On the night of the operation, Johnny and his team made their way through the jungle to the laboratory. They acted quietly and professionally, avoiding guards and cameras. When they got inside, a fierce fight began. Johnny and his men eliminated the guards and began planting explosives throughout the complex. At the climax, Johnny confronted Mendoza. A fierce fight ensued between them, in which Johnny, using all his experience and skills, won. He activated the explosives and left the laboratory with his team. They watched from afar as the entire complex blew up, destroying the drug production and everyone inside. Now that Johnny has taken down two key players in the criminal underworld, his reputation has reached new heights. He knew that he had become a legend, but he also understood that this was attracting more and more enemies to him. Johnny decided that he must continue to fight to clear his name and create a world in which he could live without fear. Johnny's next target was international arms smuggler Alexander Dragunov. This man supplied weapons to all criminal organizations, supporting them in the struggle for power and influence. Johnny knew that the elimination of Dragunov would be a powerful blow to the entire criminal world. Johnny and his team began investigating Dragunov's smuggling routes, finding out where and when the transactions were taking place. They discovered that a large shipment of weapons was to be delivered to a secret warehouse in the port of one of the major cities. Johnny decided that this would be the perfect place to strike. The operation was carefully planned. Johnny and his men entered the port using fake documents and security uniforms. They planted explosives in the warehouse and prepared for the attack. When Dragunov and his men arrived, a furious firefight began. Johnny and his team fought with determination and skill, eliminating their enemies one by one. In the midst of the battle, Johnny encountered Dragunov. A fierce struggle ensued between them, in which Johnny, despite his injuries, was able to gain the upper hand. He set off the explosives and led his team out of the port, watching as the warehouse and its entire cargo of weapons were destroyed. With each new success, Johnny felt his mission becoming more important. He understood that his struggle was not only for personal freedom, but also for cleansing the world of criminal scum. Now that everyone in criminal circles knew his name, he became a symbol of struggle and retribution. But Johnny knew that he still had a long and dangerous journey ahead, and he was ready for any challenges that might come his way. After a series of successful attacks on criminal leaders, Johnny became the object of attention not only of the criminal world, but also of law enforcement agencies. Detective Mark Raymond, who had been following Johnny for a long time, began to see in his actions an opportunity to finally deal with criminal groups and restore order. Mark decided to use all available resources to catch Johnny. Mark and his team began gathering information about Johnny, tracking his movements and contacts. They began working with international agencies to set up a network of surveillance and checkpoints at key locations. Mark knew that Johnny acted quickly and decisively, so he had to find a way to outsmart him. One day, through an informant in criminal circles, Mark received information about Johnny's next target, large businessman Thomas Wilson, who was closely associated with the remaining criminal groups. Mark decided to use this information to set a trap for Johnny. The operation was carefully planned. Mark and his team set up surveillance on Wilson in his home, knowing Johnny would show up to take him out. They prepared fake guards and booby-trapped the house to be able to control the situation. The night Johnny arrived at the scene, he immediately felt something was wrong. The security seemed too relaxed and the atmosphere suspiciously calm. However, he decided to continue following his plan. When Johnny got inside the house, he began to realize that it might be a trap. Mark and his team watched his every move. When Johnny approached Wilson's office, Mark gave the signal to begin the operation. Fake guards suddenly surrounded Johnny, but he used his skills to fight back. A furious firefight ensued, during which Johnny managed to eliminate several agents, but his strength was running out. At this point, Mark himself entered the house to personally arrest Johnny. They came face to face. Johnny, despite being tired and injured, was preparing for the last battle. A tense fight ensued between them. Mark, knowing that Johnny was incredibly dangerous, used all his skills and experience. In the end, Johnny, having exhausted all his strength, was captured. Mark ordered his men to take him to the station under strict control. Johnny, realizing that his journey was completed, accepted his fate with dignity. After Johnny's arrest, a major trial began that attracted national attention. Johnny was accused of numerous crimes, but also became a symbol of the fight against crime. Many saw him as a hero, a fighter for justice, but the law remained adamant. Mark, having completed the operation, felt proud of the work done, but also sad. He knew that Johnny was not just a criminal, but a man who was trying to cleanse the world of evil using his methods. Mark understood that sometimes unconventional decisions must be made to restore order, and that Johnny will forever remain a legend in the criminal world. Johnny, while in prison, became a living symbol of resistance and the fight for justice. Despite his imprisonment, he continued to influence the world around him, inspiring others to fight crime. His story became a lesson for many, and his name will forever remain in history as an example that even in the darkest times there is a place for light and justice. After Johnny's arrest, the police began to thoroughly investigate all his actions. Detective Mark Raymond and his team worked around the clock trying to figure out how many people were affected by Johnny's actions. During the investigation, it was discovered that he had more than 20 victims, each of which was associated with criminal structures or illegal operations. Each of Johnny's murders was carefully planned and executed with a high degree of professionalism. Many of his victims were powerful figures in the criminal world, making the investigation even more difficult and dangerous. Police collected a wealth of evidence, including weapons, fingerprints, and eyewitness accounts, to build a complete picture of his crimes. Mark and his team began interrogating, trying to understand Johnny's motives and methods. Johnny, despite his position, remained calm and cool. He was in no hurry to reveal all the details of his actions, but his answers gave the police an idea of how he acted and why he chose these particular people. Mark realized that Johnny didn't just kill for fun or money. His actions were aimed at destroying those who ran criminal operations and brought evil to society. Johnny saw himself as a fighter for justice, using radical methods to achieve his goals. During interrogations, Johnny told Mark about his past, how he became who he is. He spoke about the losses he experienced, the betrayal and pain that made him this way. Johnny admitted that his actions were not always justified, but he believed that he did the right thing. Mark, despite understanding Johnny's motives, realized that the law requires punishment for crimes. He continued the investigation, trying to find all the victims and collect as much evidence as possible. The investigation revealed that many of Johnny's victims were involved in serious crimes, including trafficking in people, drugs, and weapons. One day, Mark received unexpected information from one of his informants. It turned out that among Johnny's victims was an influential politician who secretly supported criminal groups. This fact caused a great resonance in society, and they began to put pressure on Mark, demanding a fair trial. A trial began that attracted the attention of the entire country. The prosecution and defense presented their evidence and arguments, trying to convince the court that they were right. Johnny, being under strict security, closely followed the process. The trial turned out to be complex and lengthy. Numerous witnesses testified, revealing new facts about the activities of Johnny and his victims. Some of them supported Johnny, considering him a hero who fought crime, while others insisted on strict punishment. In the end, the court rendered a verdict finding Johnny guilty of multiple murders. However, given the circumstances and motivation of his actions, the sentence was commuted. Johnny received a long prison sentence, but avoided the death penalty. After the verdict, Johnny went to prison where he began serving his long sentence. Despite his imprisonment, he remained a symbol of the fight against crime for many people. His story spread across the country, sparking heated debate about where the line between legality and justice lies. In prison, Johnny became a legend among the prisoners. Many saw him as a hero who was not afraid to challenge the system. He used his time behind bars to train other prisoners, helping them find their way and giving tips on self-defense and strategy. Johnny also became a consultant to law enforcement agencies, helping to dismantle criminal networks and providing valuable information about the criminal underworld. Meanwhile, Detective Mark Raymond continued to work for the police, using the experience gained from Johnny's case to fight crime. He realized that sometimes achieving justice requires going beyond conventional methods, and that the world is not always black and white. Mark and Johnny continued to keep in touch through letters. They exchanged thoughts about justice, crime, and human nature. Despite their different paths, they both understood that they were united by the desire for a better world. One day, a few years later, Mark received a letter from Johnny in which he talked about his vision of the future. Johnny wrote that despite his imprisonment, he found inner peace and the belief that his actions were not in vain. He expressed hope that his story will be a lesson for future generations and that someday the world will become a better place. Mark, after reading the letter, felt deep respect for Johnny. He realized that despite all the difficulties and sacrifices, Johnny left his mark on history, showing that even in the most difficult conditions you can fight for justice. Over time, Johnny's story has become an inspiration to many. His name went down in legends as a man who was not afraid to confront evil and crime, even at the cost of his own freedom. His actions and legacy live on in people's hearts, reminding them that the fight for justice is never in vain. Third criminal story. In one of the poorest areas of a small town in southern Colombia, a boy was born who was destined to become the most dangerous drug lord in the world. His name was Pedro Montalvo. From an early age, Pedro was faced with the harsh realities of life. His family lived in a small house with a leaky roof, and food on the table was rare. Pedro's mother, Maria, worked day and night to provide her children with everything they needed. She was a cleaner in rich houses, and every evening she returned home exhausted but with a smile on her face. His father, Juan, was a farmer, but his earnings were barely enough to make ends meet. Pedro often saw his father returning home after a long day on the field, covered in dirt and fatigue. He listened to his father's stories about the difficulties and injustices faced by poor people. These stories sank deep into Pedro's soul and awakened in him a desire to change his life and the life of his family. From childhood, Pedro was distinguished by his intelligence and observation. He attended a local school but often skipped classes, preferring to spend his time on the streets, where he quickly realized that the world did not work as his teachers told him. The streets became his real school. Pedro learned to survive in a cruel world by watching older boys commit petty thefts and sell drugs. One of his first teachers on the street was Raul, a local drug dealer who saw potential in Pedro. Raul was cruel and ruthless, but he taught Pedro a lot. The boy realized that the world of crime offered quick money and power, which he could never achieve through honest work. Pedro listened carefully to Raul's advice, quickly learning the art of deception and cunning. He started with small assignments, delivering drugs around the city, keeping an eye on competitors and passing on information. Raul saw Pedro as a future underworld star, and their connection grew stronger. Pedro soon became a key figure in Raul's operation. His courage and intelligence allowed him to build a network of informants among local residents who supplied him with information about the movements of the police and the actions of competitors. At the age of 14, Pedro already had a reputation that made even adult criminals respect him. But the world of the streets was merciless. One day, Raul was ambushed by competitors and was brutally killed. For Pedro, this was the moment of truth. The loss of his mentor and friend made him realize that there is no place for weakness and gullibility in this world. He decided that he would never rely on others again and took matters into his own hands. Pedro began by creating his own small group, which included the most reliable and loyal people. He offered them not only protection, but also a chance for a better future. Under his leadership, the group quickly expanded its activities, capturing more and more new territories. Pedro applied all the lessons he learned from Raul, adding his own ideas and strategies. He was not afraid to take risks, but always acted calmly and prudently. Pedro began making connections with larger drug cartels, using his wit and charisma to secure lucrative deals. He understood that in order to rise to the top, you need to be not only cruel, but also smart. Every day, Pedro faced new challenges, but this only strengthened his character. He became more and more influential and powerful, but never forgot about his past. In his heart, there was always a hatred of injustice and a desire to escape poverty, which continued to spur him to action. Years passed, and Pedro grew from a little boy living on the streets into a fearsome and respected drug lord. His name became known throughout the world, inspiring fear and respect. But he knew that there was no end to this path, and even more difficult trials awaited him. After defeating Carlos, Pedro felt invincible. But this feeling was deceptive. He knew that there were more and more enemies, and that in his position, any step could become fatal. Pedro decided that he needed to go into the shadows and begin to act even more carefully. Pedro began using new methods and technologies to cover his tracks. He hired the best cybersecurity experts to protect his communications and financial transactions. All his actions began to be carefully planned and coordinated through a complex network of intermediaries and trusted persons. Pedro understood that any mistake could cost him everything he had achieved. Meanwhile, Pedro continued to develop his legal businesses. He became an influential figure in business circles, and his name was increasingly mentioned in the news in the context of philanthropy and social responsibility. He opened several schools and medical clinics in poor areas, trying to improve the lives of the people among whom he grew up. But even his good deeds had a hidden meaning. Pedro bought the loyalty of local residents, who became his eyes and ears on the streets. One day, Pedro received information that several agents of an international anti-drug organization had begun an investigation into his activities. They worked undercover, trying to gather evidence that could lead to his arrest. Pedro decided to be proactive. He ordered his men to find out everything they could about the agents and their methods of work. With the help of bribed informants and hacked databases, Pedro learned about plans for an operation against him. He realized that the only way to maintain his freedom and influence was to eliminate the threat. Pedro developed a cunning plan that would allow him to lead the agents onto the wrong trail. He organized a fake operation to transport a large shipment of drugs, setting everything up so that the agents received information about it. When the agents arrived at the scene, an unpleasant surprise awaited them. Pedro and his men captured them and took them to a secret hideout. Pedro personally interrogated the agents, learning about all the details of the investigation. He realized that the problem was much more serious than he thought. Not only local law enforcement agencies, but also international intelligence agencies were working against him. Realizing that his enemies had become even more dangerous, Pedro decided to make a move that would shock everyone. He released the agents, but not before forcing them to convey a message to their superiors. Pedro said that he was ready to negotiate, and that his power was so great that no one could stop him. It was a bold move that was meant to show his confidence and power. However, Pedro knew inside that the game had become too dangerous. He began to prepare escape routes if the situation became unbearable. Pedro developed several false identities and secret hideouts around the world where he could hide if necessary. Time passed and tension grew. Pedro knew that each new day could be his last free, but he was determined to go to the end. In his heart there was always a hatred of injustice and a desire to escape poverty, and now he was ready to defend everything he had built until his last breath. Despite pressure from law enforcement, Pedro continued to expand his empire. He began to play on the international stage, making deals with cartels from Mexico, as well as with European and Asian criminal organizations. His name became synonymous with power and fear in the criminal world. However, Pedro knew that his enemies would not stop. He needed to find a way to strengthen his position and reduce the risk of exposure. He began to look for allies among high-ranking officials and government officials. Through bribes, threats, and blackmail, Pedro managed to recruit several influential people who could protect his interests. One of these people was General Armando Velázquez, head of the Colombian National Police. Velázquez was known for his intransigence towards criminals, but Pedro managed to find incriminating evidence on him and use it for his own purposes. The general reluctantly agreed to cooperate, realizing that this was the only way to save his career and life. Pedro began to receive information about all the operations planned against him. This allowed him to always be one step ahead of his enemies. He organized false operations to divert the attention of the police and intelligence agencies, and also held secret meetings with international partners, strengthening his connections. Soon, Pedro decided to expand his influence in the political sphere. He began supporting several up-and-coming politicians by financing their election campaigns. In exchange for this, they promised to protect and lobby Pedro's interests in government circles. One of these politicians, Rafael Garcia, became the mayor of a large city. With his help, Pedro gained access to information about the actions of local law enforcement agencies and control over some city enterprises. But despite all the precautions, Pedro could not get rid of the feeling that the circle around him was shrinking. He knew that his enemies would stop at nothing to overthrow him. This feeling was confirmed when one of his trusted men, Carlos, was found dead. This was a clear attempt to intimidate Pedro and show that no one around him was safe. Pedro decided that the time had come for drastic measures. He began to plan an operation that could not only protect him from his enemies, but also secure his position for many years. He was going to organize a large-scale supply of drugs to the United States, using a new network of routes and methods not yet known to law enforcement agencies. This operation was to be the largest and most daring of his entire career. To prepare the operation, Pedro attracted the best specialists, including former military personnel, engineers, and hackers. He spared no expense and resources, realizing that his life and everything that he had built was at stake. Every detail of the plan was thought out to the smallest detail, from transportation to local distribution of goods. But even the best laid plans can go wrong. On the day of the operation, Pedro received a message that one of his key agents had been arrested. This meant that the entire operation could be in jeopardy. Pedro quickly gathered his closest associates to discuss how to proceed. Time was running out, and Pedro decided to continue the operation despite the risk. He understood that retreat now would mean defeat. He ordered his men to follow the plan and make every effort to complete it successfully. The operation continued despite the arrest of a key agent. Pedro knew that now everything depended on coordination and speed of action. He contacted Miguel, his chief logistics officer, to ensure delivery routes were changed and all safety precautions were followed. At this time, in the United States, a special anti-drug group, headed by Agent Rebecca Smith, received information about the impending operation. Rebecca had been hunting for Pedro for a long time and saw this operation as a chance to put an end to his empire once and for all. She understood that she needed to act quickly and decisively. Pedro knew about the approaching danger and decided to play it safe. He ordered his men to create several diversionary maneuvers to confuse law enforcement. False loads were launched and sent along secondary routes, diverting attention to themselves. At this time, the real cargo, carefully disguised, crossed the border under the guise of legal goods. Pedro understood that discipline and coherence of his team played a key role at this stage. Each person knew his role and acted strictly according to plan. However, Rebecca did not give up. She intuitively felt that Pedro was preparing something big. Through data analysis and information from informants, she was able to identify several suspicious routes. She decided to conduct several raids simultaneously to catch Pedro by surprise. The decisive moment has arrived. One of the cargoes, following the main route, was discovered by Rebecca's agents. A chase began, which could lead to the failure of the entire operation. Pedro watched events unfold from a safe distance, receiving constant updates from his men. Realizing that the situation was getting out of control, Pedro decided to activate the last stage of the plan. He gave the command to destroy the cargo to prevent its capture. At the same time, the remaining routes continued to move, avoiding clashes with law enforcement agencies. Rebecca was furious when she learned that the cargo had been destroyed, but she didn't give up. Her team continued to follow other routes, hoping to find at least some traces of Pedro's activities. Despite all the difficulties and risks, most of the cargo achieved its goals. Pedro knew that the victory was temporary and that Rebecca and her team would not stop there. But he also understood that every successful move brought him closer to the unattainable ideal of complete immunity and control. Pedro decided that he needed to strengthen his defense. He began investing in even more sophisticated security systems, including biometric locks and monitoring systems. He also stepped up measures to protect his loved ones, aware that his enemies might try to use them to put pressure on him. Meanwhile, Rebecca was developing new strategies. She understood that Pedro had become even more careful and cunning, but she was not going to give up. Her goal was clear: to overthrow Pedro and destroy his empire. Pedro realized that his game of survival was becoming more intense every day. He knew that his inner circle of trusted people was his most valuable resource. Two people stood out among them: Alejandro, his chief strategist, and Sofia, a talented analyst who could predict the moves of enemies several moves ahead. Alejandro proposed expanding operations to other regions where Pedro's influence was still weak. This would provide an opportunity to create additional sources of income and reduce dependence on current routes that were already under the radar of law enforcement. Sofia, in turn, developed a comprehensive plan to collect and analyze data on the movements of Rebecca's agents in order to always be one step ahead. During this time, Rebecca realized that she needed to go beyond standard methods to catch Pedro. She decided to involve international organizations in the investigation and strengthen cooperation with the authorities of other countries. Her goal was not just to catch Pedro, but to destroy his entire network. Pedro continued to strengthen his position. He began investing in high-tech companies that could give him access to advanced security and monitoring systems. One of these companies was an artificial intelligence development company that created a unique data analysis and threat prediction system for Pedro. One day, Pedro received disturbing news. One of his closest associates, Ricardo, was captured by Rebecca's agents. This was a serious blow, since Ricardo knew many of the organization's secrets. Pedro knew he needed to act quickly to prevent information leakage. Pedro called an emergency meeting with Alejandro and Sofia. They decided that they needed to carry out an operation to save Ricardo, but to do it in such a way as not to arouse suspicion. It was decided to use a diversion to divert the attention of Rebecca and her team. On the night of the operation, Pedro's team set off a series of explosions at several sites associated with his activities. This forced Rebecca and her agents to focus their efforts on investigating these incidents, leaving the base where Ricardo was being held with minimal security. Meanwhile, a specially trained group led by Alejandro entered the base. They acted quickly and decisively, using advanced technology and equipment. Ricardo was rescued and taken to safety. The operation was successful, but Pedro understood that it was only a temporary victory. Rebecca was furious. Her plan to capture Ricardo failed, and she realized that Pedro was willing to do anything to protect his people. She decided it was time to use unconventional methods. Rebecca enlisted the help of an old friend and colleague, a psychological profiler, to try to predict Pedro's next moves. Pedro, in turn, understood that he needed to further strengthen security. It began installing facial recognition and biometric identification systems at all its facilities. Each member of his team was thoroughly vetted and trained to operate in high-threat environments. Several months passed and the situation seemed to have stabilized. But Pedro knew that this was just the calm before the storm. He continued to develop new strategies and plans, preparing for the inevitable clash with Rebecca and her team. As months turned into years, Pedro continued to strengthen his empire despite Rebecca's relentless attempts to destroy him. Each new obstacle only strengthened his character and made his operations more sophisticated. With the help of Alejandro and Sofia, Pedro created increasingly complex schemes to evade justice and expand his network. Pedro decided that he needed to infiltrate the political elite, not only of Colombia, but also of neighboring countries. He started with Mexico, where he found several promising politicians willing to cooperate in exchange for financial support. He created a powerful coalition that allowed him to control important transport routes and expand his operations into new territories. One of his key allies was the governor of the Mexican state of Sinaloa, Miguel Aguirre. Miguel was an ambitious, well-connected politician with a willingness to take risks. He provided Pedro with access to ports and logistics centers, making it much easier to transport drugs to the United States and other countries. In exchange, Pedro supported Miguel's election campaign, ensuring his victory in the elections. With the help of his new allies, Pedro developed an even more complex smuggling network. He began using underground tunnels running under the U.S.-Mexico border, as well as underwater transport systems that allowed drugs to be delivered almost undetected. His operations became so sophisticated that even Rebecca's most experienced agents were unable to uncover them. Rebecca, in turn, did not give up. She understood that Pedro had become much more powerful than before, and his influence had spread to several countries. She began to cooperate with international law enforcement agencies, including Interpol and Europol, to join forces in the fight against him. She also stepped up measures to protect her informants and agents, knowing that Pedro would stop at nothing to protect his empire. One day, Pedro received information that Rebecca was planning a major operation against him. She assembled an international coalition to simultaneously strike several of his targets in different countries. Pedro knew that this could be the decisive moment in their confrontation. He called an emergency meeting with his closest associates. Alejandro suggested setting a trap for Rebecca by giving her false information about a large drug shipment that was about to cross the border. Sofia devised a plan to misinform Rebecca's agents in order to divert their attention from the real operations. The plan was simple and risky. Pedro orchestrated a series of fake operations that were intended to divert the attention of law enforcement and make them believe that they were close to capturing Pedro. While Rebecca's agents were pursuing false targets, the real drug trafficking operation took a completely different route. Rebecca and her team were ready. They received information about a large shipment of drugs that was supposed to cross the border on the night of the operation. All efforts were devoted to intercepting this shipment. However, when agents arrived at the scene, they found empty containers and dummies that were distracting their attention. The real cargo, carefully camouflaged, has already crossed the border through tunnels and underwater systems. The operation was successful, and Pedro was once again one step ahead of his enemies. But he understood that this was only a temporary victory. Pedro knew he needed to continue to strengthen his position and look for new ways to defend. It began investing in advanced technologies, including artificial intelligence and biometric security systems, to protect its operations from intrusion. He also stepped up measures to protect his loved ones, aware that his enemies might try to use them to put pressure on him. Several years passed and Pedro continued to rule his empire, becoming more powerful and influential. But there was always anxiety in his heart. He knew that sooner or later his enemies would find a way to break through his defenses. And when this happens, he will have to face the greatest test of his life. After a temporary respite, Pedro decided to redouble his efforts to strengthen his criminal empire. He realized that he needed to not only defend himself, but also attack. His enemies must understand that it is better not to mess with him. The first thing Pedro did was strengthen his security. He hired the best mercenaries from the former military and intelligence agencies, providing them with the most modern weapons and equipment. He also created several hidden bases throughout the country where his men could take refuge and regroup if attacked. Next, he decided to strengthen his network of informants. Pedro knew that information was the key to power. He began paying generous bribes to police officers, officials, and ordinary citizens to inform him of all the movements and plans of his enemies. Thus, he was always one step ahead of his competitors and law enforcement agencies. Pedro also decided to strike at his enemies. He knew that Rebecca and her team would not rest until they caught him. So he began to develop a plan to neutralize them. With the help of his informants, he learned about several key agents who were working with Rebecca. He decided that they needed to be eliminated. The first target is Agent Thomas, who led operations against Pedro in South America. Pedro sent his best men into an ambush, and Thomas was killed under mysterious circumstances. This sent a strong signal to the other agents. Pedro was ready to defend himself by any means necessary. The next target was Agent Anna, who was involved in financial investigations against Pedro. She was kidnapped right from her home, and a few days later her body was found in the river. This caused a wave of fear among the agents, and many of them began to leave Rebecca's team, fearing for their lives. Rebecca was furious. She understood that Pedro would stop at nothing to protect his empire, but she also knew that these actions made him even more vulnerable. She decided it was time for a decisive blow. Rebecca began working to create an international coalition to capture Pedro. She contacted authorities in the US, Europe, and Asia to organize joint raids on his facilities around the world. This operation had to be coordinated down to the smallest detail so as not to give Pedro any chance of escape. Pedro learned about the impending operation through his own channels. He understood that this would be the most difficult battle of his life. He gathered his best people and began to prepare for defense. He ordered to strengthen the security of all his facilities and prepare alternate routes for retreat. The day of the operation arrived. Raids on Pedro's properties began around the world, but he was ready. His people fought back fiercely, using all available resources and technology. In some places they managed to repel the attack, but in others they suffered serious losses. Pedro personally supervised the defense of his facilities. He knew that his life and everything he had built depended on the outcome of this battle. He fought to the last, but understood that the forces were unequal. He had to make the difficult decision to retreat. Pedro and his closest associates hid in one of his secret hideouts. He knew that this was a temporary solution and that his enemies would not stop until they caught him. But he was determined to continue the fight. In his heart, there was always a hatred of injustice and a desire to escape poverty. And now he was ready to defend everything he had built until his last breath. Pedro realized that his empire was under threat as never before. International raids and the murders of his comrades shook his position, but he was not going to give up. He decided to go on the offensive and show his enemies that he could not be easily destroyed. Pedro knew he had to strike a series of brutal blows to demoralize his enemies and strengthen his influence in the criminal world. He decided to start by eliminating the main competitors in Colombia and neighboring countries. To do this, he turned to his old allies Miguel and Alejandro to coordinate these operations. The first target was José Rodriguez, a drug lord who controlled vast areas of northern Colombia. Pedro sent a group of his best mercenaries to capture and destroy his entire organization. The operation was quick and merciless. Pedro's gunmen broke into José's mansion, destroying all the guards and José himself. This sent a signal to other competitors: no one can feel safe. The next target was a cartel from Venezuela, which began to threaten Pedro's border operations. Pedro developed a plan that included bribing corrupt military personnel and launching an organized attack on the cartel's main bases. At the same time, he used his connections in the Venezuelan army to provide cover for his operations. The plan was carried out with cold-blooded precision. The cartel's bases were destroyed and their leaders were either killed or captured. These actions strengthened Pedro's reputation as a ruthless and all-powerful leader. His influence spread, and even his enemies began to think twice before challenging him. Meanwhile, Pedro decided to expand his operations in the United States. He began working with local gangs, providing them with drugs in exchange for support and protection. These gangs helped distribute the goods and eliminate competitors who tried to enter Pedro's market. One of these gangs was especially important to Pedro. This was the Northern Wolves Group, which controlled a significant part of drug trafficking on the west coast of the United States. Pedro offered them a deal that included regular supplies of drugs, as well as financial and military support. In exchange, the Northern Wolves pledged to protect Pedro's interests and ensure the safety of his operations. With the help of the Northern Wolves, Pedro was able to quickly expand his network throughout the United States. He used bribery and blackmail to subjugate corrupt officials and police officers. His influence grew and he began to feel more confident. But even in this success, Pedro understood that his main threat remained Rebecca. He knew she wouldn't stop until she got her way. Therefore, he decided to strike at her too. Pedro began to collect information about Rebecca and her closest associates. He learned that she had a family, which she tried to keep secret. Pedro decided to use this to his advantage. He developed a plan that involved kidnapping her family members to force her to stop hunting him. The operation was carefully planned and executed with precision. Pedro's men kidnapped Rebecca's son and husband, leaving her a message demanding that she stop all operations against him. It was a daring and cruel move that should have forced her to retreat. Rebecca was furious, but she understood that now not only her life was at stake, but also the lives of her loved ones. She decided to take a risky step and enter into negotiations with Pedro. She proposed a temporary truce and a meeting to discuss the terms of her family's release. Pedro agreed to the meeting, but he did not trust Rebecca. He understood that this could be a trap. He prepared for any eventuality by placing his men around the perimeter of the meeting place and installing hidden cameras for surveillance. At the meeting, Pedro and Rebecca came face to face for the first time. There was tension in the air. Pedro offered his own conditions. He would release her family if Rebecca stopped all operations against him and revoked the international warrants for his arrest. Rebecca reluctantly agreed, realizing that this was the only way to save her loved ones. After the release of Rebecca's family, a temporary truce took effect, but Pedro knew it was only a matter of time before Rebecca started hunting again. He began to prepare for the next stage of his struggle, realizing that every day could be decisive. After meeting with Rebecca and a temporary truce, Pedro decided to take advantage of the respite to further strengthen his empire. He understood that this truce was only an illusion of security and that Rebecca would soon resume the hunt. Pedro decided to be proactive. The first step was the creation of a new, more complex smuggling network. Pedro began collaborating with international crime syndicates to expand his drug supply routes into Europe and Asia. He established connections with the Italian mafia, Russian and Chinese triads. These alliances allowed him to strengthen his position and create a powerful network spanning the entire world. One of Pedro's key partners in Europe was Lorenzo De Luca, the head of the Italian mafia in Naples. Lorenzo was known for his cruelty and skill in business. Pedro offered him a deal that included joint operations to transport drugs through the ports of Italy and other European countries. In exchange, Pedro gave Lorenzo access to his supply chains and protection from competitors. In Russia, Pedro established connections with an influential crime lord named Sergei Volkov. Volkov controlled a significant part of drug trafficking in Eastern Europe and was interested in expanding his activities. Pedro offered him a partnership that included a mutually beneficial exchange of resources and information. This allowed Pedro to strengthen his position in the region and expand his network. But Pedro knew that external alliances were not enough to protect his empire. He decided to strengthen internal security measures. Pedro hired the best cybersecurity experts to create impenetrable systems to protect his data and communications. He also strengthened measures to protect his people, providing them with the most modern weapons and equipment. During this time, Rebecca, despite the temporary truce, continued to collect information about Pedro and his operations. She knew that her chance to win would come when Pedro made a mistake. She decided to use all available means to monitor his actions and prepare for a new blow. One of these means was an undercover agent whom Rebecca introduced into Pedro's organization. This agent, Manuel, worked for Pedro for a long time and earned his trust. He provided Rebecca with valuable information about Pedro's plans and operations, helping her stay one step ahead. Manuel learned that Pedro was planning a large operation to transport drugs through the Caribbean Sea to the United States. This was an important operation that could bring Pedro huge profits and strengthen his position in the market. Rebecca decided this was her chance to strike the finishing blow. She organized a joint operation with the U.S. Coast Guard and international partners to intercept the cargo and arrest Pedro's men. The operation was carefully planned and coordinated. On the day the cargo was on its way, Rebecca's agents and the Coast Guard began an operation to seize it. But Pedro was ready. He knew about the impending operation thanks to his informants and developed a plan for a counterattack. He set up several false routes to confuse law enforcement and prepared his forces to protect the real cargo. When Rebecca's agents and the Coast Guard intercepted one of the decoys, they encountered fierce resistance. Pedro's people were ready for battle and gave a serious rebuff. At this time, the real cargo, under the protection of well-armed guards, continued its movement along a different route. Rebecca's operation was unsuccessful. Although they managed to capture several false cargoes and arrest several people, the real cargo reached its destination safely. Pedro was once again one step ahead, but he knew that this success was only temporary. After this operation, Pedro decided that it was time to strike at Rebecca herself. He knew that her main weakness was her loyalty to her team and loved ones. Pedro devised a plan to intimidate her into retreating. He began by attacking targets associated with her team. Several agents were killed and their families were threatened. This caused a wave of fear and paranoia among the agents, many of whom began to doubt their safety. Rebecca realized that Pedro had started hunting her and her team. She decided to take drastic measures to protect her people and continue the fight. She contacted international organizations to obtain additional support and resources. Meanwhile, Pedro continued to strengthen his empire. He knew that every new day brought new threats, but he was ready to fight. In his heart, there was always a hatred of injustice and a desire to escape poverty, and now he was ready to defend everything he had built until his last breath. The hatred and determination in Pedro's heart made him even more cruel and ruthless. His attacks on Rebecca's people created chaos and fear, but she did not retreat. Rebecca knew that every operation, every arrest could bring her closer to her goal, to catch Pedro. Meanwhile, Pedro decided to strengthen his presence in the drug market. He knew that to do this he needed to not only protect his current routes, but also find new ones. He turned his attention to Africa, where the drug trade was gaining momentum. With the help of his allies in Europe and Asia, Pedro began to establish new connections and create new supply channels. One of Pedro's key partners in Africa was Samir Njuma, an influential crime boss in West Africa. Samir controlled a significant portion of the drug trafficking passing through the region and was interested in expanding his activities. Pedro offered him mutually beneficial cooperation, which included the supply of drugs, weapons, and financial support. With Samir's help, Pedro began sending drugs through Africa to Europe and Asia, using sea and air routes. These operations allowed him to increase profits and strengthen his influence on the international stage. But Pedro understood that every new deal and every new partner adds new risks and threats. During this time, Rebecca continued to gather information about Pedro and his operations. Her agent Manuel was able to infiltrate Pedro's African network and began to supply valuable data on new routes and partners. Rebecca decided it was time to strike again. She organized an international operation to intercept one of Pedro's large cargoes, which was heading from Africa to Europe. The operation was carefully planned and involved coordination between law enforcement agencies in several countries. The day the cargo was set to travel, Rebecca's agents and their international partners began an operation to seize it. But Pedro was ready. He knew about Rebecca's plans thanks to his informants and developed a plan for a counterattack. He set up several false routes to confuse law enforcement and prepared his forces to protect the real cargo. When Rebecca's agents and their associates intercepted one of the decoys, they encountered fierce resistance. Pedro's people were ready for battle and gave a serious rebuff. At this time, the real cargo, under the protection of well-armed guards, continued its movement along a different route. Rebecca's operation was unsuccessful. Although they managed to capture several false cargoes and arrest several people, the real cargo reached its destination safely. Pedro was once again one step ahead, but he knew that this success was only temporary. After this operation, Pedro decided that it was time to strike again at Rebecca. He knew that her main weakness was her loyalty to her team and loved ones. Pedro devised a plan to intimidate her into retreating. He began by attacking targets associated with her team. Several agents were killed and their families were threatened. This caused a wave of fear and paranoia among the agents, many of whom began to doubt their safety. Rebecca realized that Pedro had started hunting her and her team. She decided to take drastic measures to protect her people and continue the fight. She contacted international organizations to obtain additional support and resources. Meanwhile, Pedro continued to strengthen his empire. He knew that every new day brought new threats, but he was ready to fight. In his heart, there was always a hatred of injustice and a desire to escape poverty, and now he was ready to defend everything he had built until his last breath. To strengthen his position, Pedro began to attract new technologies. He hired the best cybersecurity and artificial intelligence experts to create systems that would help him predict the actions of his enemies and protect his operations. This allowed him to further increase his efficiency and reduce risks. Soon, Pedro decided to strike again at Rebecca. He organized a series of explosions at facilities associated with its operations. These actions were meant to demoralize her team and show that he was ready to do anything to protect his empire. The explosions caused chaos and fear, but Rebecca did not back down. She knew that her only chance to defeat Pedro was to continue fighting, despite all the threats. Pedro and Rebecca continued their cruel game of cat and mouse. Each new day brought new attacks, new victims, and new strategies. Both understood that their confrontation could only end when one of them was destroyed. Pedro knew that Rebecca was his main threat. He knew that as long as she lived and continued her hunt, his empire would not be safe. Therefore, he decided to hire the best assassins to eliminate her. These men were professionals, ruthless and efficient, willing to complete any task for the right price. Pedro contacted Dmitry Volkov, the leader of a renowned international group of mercenaries who specialized in eliminating high-profile targets. Dmitry was known for his coolness and professionalism, and his team consisted of former special forces and operatives. Pedro offered Dmitry a generous sum for the murder of Rebecca and her closest associates. Dmitry and his team began to carefully plan the operation. They studied all aspects of Rebecca's life, her habits, travel routes, and security. They knew it would be a difficult task as Rebecca was an experienced agent and always took precautions. But Dmitry was confident in his people and their abilities. The operation began early in the morning as Rebecca was heading to work. She was traveling in an armored car with guards, but Dmitry's mercenaries were ready. They set up an ambush on one of the narrow sections of the road, where it was easiest to attack. An explosive device planted in advance disabled Rebecca's armored car, forcing her to stop. The security immediately became combat-ready, but Dmitry's mercenaries acted quickly and decisively. A fierce firefight ensued, during which most of Rebecca's guards were killed. Rebecca, using her skills and experience, was able to escape from the car and take refuge in a nearby building. She understood that her life was in danger, but she was ready to fight to the end. Dmitry and his men began to comb the building, methodically and mercilessly destroying everything in their path. At this time, Rebecca contacted her team, who immediately went to help. She knew she had to hold out until reinforcements arrived. Using her knowledge of tactics and terrain, Rebecca set several traps for the mercenaries, delaying them and ambushing them. But Dmitry was an experienced fighter. He understood that Rebecca would not give up without a fight, and he was preparing for a protracted fight. During the shootout, Rebecca managed to wound several mercenaries, but she herself was wounded in the shoulder. Despite the pain, she continued to fight, knowing that her life depended on her every move. Finally, Rebecca's reinforcements arrived. Her team burst into the building, starting a shootout with Dmitry's mercenaries. Chaos ensued, and in the confusion, Rebecca was able to escape. She knew that she urgently needed to leave the battlefield and go to a safe shelter. Realizing that the operation had failed, Dmitry gave the order to his men to retreat. They quickly left the building, leaving destruction and chaos in their wake. Rebecca was injured but alive. She knew that this incident was a direct blow to Pedro and that he would not stop until he got his way. Returning to her hideout, Rebecca realized she needed to take drastic measures. She decided it was time to go on the offensive and strike back. She began to develop a plan to capture key figures in Pedro's organization in order to weaken his influence and force him to make a mistake. Pedro, upon learning of the failure of the operation, was furious. He understood that Rebecca would become even more cautious and decisive. He knew that eliminating her had become an even more difficult task, but he was not going to back down. Pedro decided that he needed to find a new approach and strike a blow that Rebecca would not be able to anticipate. Pedro couldn't afford to show weakness. He understood that now he needed to act even more decisively and ruthlessly. The failure of the operation against Rebecca showed him that it was necessary to change tactics and use more cunning methods. Pedro decided that the next attempt to eliminate Rebecca should not only be sudden, but also carefully planned. He turned to his longtime ally, a hacker named Lorenzo, who had exceptional skills in cybercrime. Lorenzo could hack any security system and penetrate the most secure databases. Pedro's plan was to use Lorenzo to gain information about all of Rebecca's movements and communications. The hacker had to hack into her email, phones, and surveillance systems. This would allow Pedro to gain a full understanding of her plans and prepare a new operation to eliminate her. Lorenzo quickly completed the task. He managed to hack all of Rebecca's devices and gain access to her secret files. Pedro now knew her every move, every message, and every place where she appeared. This gave him a huge advantage. Using the data obtained, Pedro developed a new plan. He decided to use disinformation to lure Rebecca into a trap. He fed her false information about a supposedly large drug deal that was about to take place at one of his properties. This place was carefully prepared for an ambush. Rebecca, considering the information reliable, decided to use this chance to capture Pedro. She gathered her team and began preparing for the operation. They devised a plan of attack, thinking they could take Pedro by surprise and finally capture him. The day of the operation arrived. Rebecca and her team arrived on the scene, ready to fight. But when they entered the building, they were greeted not by drugs and dealers, but by empty rooms and silence. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut and the building was filled with Pedro's men, armed to the teeth. A fierce firefight began. Rebecca and her team were trapped, unable to escape. Pedro's people acted coordinatedly and mercilessly, trying to destroy everyone without exception. Rebecca realized that they had fallen into a carefully planned trap. However, she was not going to give up. Using her skills and experience, she began to organize a defense. Her team, although it suffered losses, began to counterattack, using any available cover. In the midst of the battle, Rebecca was able to reach the communications device and call for reinforcements. Pedro watched what was happening through surveillance cameras. He saw Rebecca and her team fighting for their lives and realized that eliminating her had become even more difficult than he had imagined. But he had no intention of backing down. He ordered his men to continue the attack no matter what. Rebecca's reinforcements arrived a few minutes later. They burst into the building, starting a fierce firefight with Pedro's men. In the chaos and confusion, Rebecca was able to organize a counterattack and break through the enemy's defenses. Her team acted smoothly and efficiently, pushing Pedro's men out of the building. Realizing that the situation was getting out of control, Pedro ordered his men to retreat. He knew that another failure could cost him dearly. He decided he needed to step back and reconsider his methods. Rebecca and her team were victorious in this battle, but they suffered significant losses. She knew that Pedro would not stop and would continue to try to eliminate her. She decided it was time to go on the offensive and strike back, which could be decisive. Pedro, in turn, realized that his enemies were becoming more and more dangerous. He began to prepare for a new stage of the struggle, knowing that even more brutal and merciless clashes awaited him. Pedro retreated to his refuge, holding his anger and determination. He knew that his attempts to eliminate Rebecca had only escalated the situation. Now he needed to strike a blow that would once and for all break her resistance and establish his power in the underworld. At this moment, Pedro decided to attract even more brutal and experienced mercenaries, those who were ready to do anything for a large sum of money. He became involved with a group of international hitmen known as the Shadows, who were known for their ruthlessness and professionalism. These people asked no questions and left no witnesses. Pedro gave them a mission: to eliminate Rebecca and all of her closest associates, including informants and undercover agents. He wanted this strike to be fast, precise, and uncompromising. The Shadows began their hunt. They acted secretly, carefully planning their every action. Their first target was one of Rebecca's closest associates, Agent Mark, who was involved in financial investigations against Pedro. Mark was tracked down and killed in his own home, leaving only traces that led to Pedro. The next target was Agent Sarah, who was responsible for coordinating operations against Pedro. Shadows entered her apartment and ambushed her. They waited for her to return home and struck when she least expected it. Sarah was killed quickly and quietly, leaving her body as a warning to others. Rebecca was furious and horrified. She understood that Pedro would not stop until he destroyed everyone who stood in his way. She tightened security and ordered her people to be ready. But even this could not prevent the next attack. The Shadows continued the hunt, eliminating Rebecca's agents and informants one after another. Their actions were fast and deadly, leaving no time to react. Soon, Rebecca's entire department was in danger of being destroyed. Rebecca knew she had to strike back or her team would be destroyed. She decided to use the latest resources and information to deal a powerful blow to Pedro's empire. She contacted international law enforcement agencies and organized a major operation to seize several of Pedro's key assets. The operation began with simultaneous raids on Pedro's warehouses, laboratories, and logistics centers in several countries. Rebecca personally led one of the raids to show that she did not give up and was ready to fight to the end. During the raids, dozens of Pedro's people were arrested and huge quantities of drugs and weapons were seized. This was a serious blow to his empire, which showed that Rebecca did not intend to retreat. Pedro, learning about the losses, was furious. He knew that Rebecca had gone on the offensive and that he needed to take drastic measures. He decided to use his entire arsenal to regain control and show who was in charge. Pedro ordered his men to launch a series of attacks on key law enforcement-related installations and infrastructure. These attacks were meant to create chaos and fear, showing that Pedro was willing to do anything for his empire. The attacks began with explosions at several police stations and law enforcement offices. The explosions were carefully planned and synchronized to cause maximum damage and paralyze the police. At the same time, Pedro's men began to ambush patrols and detainee convoys, initiating brutal firefights and freeing their own. Rebecca knew the situation was getting out of control. She knew that Pedro was becoming more desperate and dangerous. She needed to find a way to stop him before it was too late. In a desperate attempt, Rebecca decided to use an old government connection. She turned to her former colleague, who now held a senior position in the Ministry of Defense. She told him everything that was happening and asked for help in organizing an operation using military force. The colleague agreed to help, realizing that Pedro posed a threat not only to law enforcement, but also to national security. He organized a special operation with the participation of elite units that were supposed to deal a decisive blow to Pedro's empire. The operation began with a large-scale invasion of several key Pedro installations. Military forces used all available means, including helicopters, armored vehicles, and special forces. This was a real assault aimed at destroying Pedro's entire infrastructure. At this time, Pedro, realizing that his empire was collapsing, began to prepare for the last battle. He gathered all his remaining men and fortified his main refuge, preparing to defend himself to the last. He knew that this was his last chance to hold on to everything he had built. The assault began early in the morning. Military forces surrounded Pedro's hideout and launched a massive attack. The smell of gunpowder was in the air and explosions were heard. Pedro's men fought desperately, but their forces were insignificant compared to the power of the war machine. In the midst of the battle, Pedro realized that it was all over. He knew that he could not hold on to his empire, but he was determined to fight to the end. He picked up his weapon and walked to the front line, ready to face his fate. Pedro understood that his empire was collapsing, and that the victory of Rebecca and her allies was inevitable. In a shelter surrounded on all sides, he made his final decision. He knew that he could not escape capture, and that his enemies would do anything to break his spirit and show the world his fall. Pedro climbed to the roof of his fortified complex, which overlooked the unfolding battle. He watched as his men fought desperately to hold their ground, but knew it was only a matter of time. The smell of gunpowder and burning equipment was in the air, and explosions and screams were heard in the distance. Pedro knew that his death should be symbolic, that it should leave a mark on the hearts of those who supported him and those who hated him. He pulled out a photo of his family from his pocket, his mother and father, who had always been a source of strength and motivation for him. He looked at their faces and remembered how it all began, with a dream to escape poverty and injustice. He took out his pistol, which he always had with him. This was the weapon with which he fought through many battles and survived many dangerous situations. Pedro knew that it was with this pistol that he would meet his death. Raising the weapon to his temple, Pedro took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. At that moment, his whole life flashed before his eyes, his childhood on the streets, his first steps in the criminal world, his rise to the top of the drug business, and numerous battles for his survival. He understood that every step he took, every decision led him to this moment. Taking one last look at the chaos around him, Pedro clutched the gun tightly and said in a quiet voice, "I was what I was supposed to be." Then he pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot drowned out all other sounds of the battle. Pedro fell onto the roof of his shelter, leaving behind only a bloody stain and a pistol that rolled to the side. At that moment, everything around froze. His men, seeing that their leader had fallen, began to surrender or retreat. Rebecca and her allies heard the shot and knew the battle was over. Rebecca went up to the roof to make sure Pedro was dead. She saw his body lying in a pool of blood and felt mixed feelings. It was a victory, but a bitter victory. Pedro was her greatest enemy, but he was also her greatest challenge, an adversary who forced her through many trials. Soon news of Pedro's death spread throughout the world. His death became a symbol of the fall of a great empire, but also a warning to all who sought to follow his path. His name remains in history as one of the most dangerous and influential drug lords, but also as a man who could not escape his end. After Pedro's death, his empire quickly fell apart. Without their leader, his people lost morale and organization. Rebecca and her allies began a massive operation to seize Pedro's remaining assets, arresting his closest associates and dismantling his criminal networks. The remnants of Pedro's cartel tried to resist, but without his strategic mind and leadership, they could not hold out. Many of them were arrested, and those who escaped arrest fled or died in internecine wars for the remaining inheritance. Rebecca was finally able to catch her breath. She knew her work wasn't over yet, but Pedro's death was a huge victory. This moment became a turning point in her career and life. She suffered great losses, but her determination and perseverance led to success. Rebecca continued to work, leading international operations against the remaining drug cartels and criminal organizations. She became known in law enforcement circles as an implacable fighter against organized crime. Her methods and strategies became a model for many other agents and operatives around the world. Meanwhile, changes began in Colombia and other countries where Pedro had influence. The authorities have launched active reforms aimed at combating corruption and drug trafficking. However, Pedro's legacy continued to influence these regions. Many remembered him as a fierce, yet charismatic leader who managed to achieve incredible heights despite his background and circumstances. People in the poor areas where Pedro began his life recalled his charitable projects and the support he provided. To some, he was a hero. To others, he was the embodiment of evil. But one thing was clear. His story left an indelible mark on everyone who knew him or heard about him. Several years passed, and Rebecca, despite her successes, still felt the weight of the losses she had experienced. She often thought about Pedro, about how their paths had crossed and how this confrontation had changed them both. She knew that her work would never be finished, but every day she dedicated to fighting crime was a tribute to those who fell in this fight. The story of Pedro Montalvo remained in textbooks and chronicles as an example of how far a person driven by hatred and lust for power can go. His life and death became a lesson for all who choose the path of crime, showing that even the most powerful empires can collapse, and their leaders can be vulnerable. Thus ended the story of one of the most dangerous drug lords in the world. But the fight against crime continued, and new heroes stood up to defend the law, inspired by Rebecca's example and her determination to see the matter through to the end.